Deep in the archives of a library in Iceland, there sits a medieval manuscript known as the Codex Regius. On its weathered vellum pages, written in a steady, careful hand, is a collection of poems. These poems tell of gods and giants, of a world tree connecting realms of fire and ice, and of a final, world-shattering battle. For centuries, we have treated these as fantastic myths, the imaginative tales of a bygone people. Yet scattered throughout these stories are oddly specific astronomical and geological details, descriptions of cosmic events, and a primordial state of being that feel less like fantasy and more like a kind of poetic, inherited memory. What if, buried within the epic tales of Odin and Thor, lies a forgotten attempt to explain the very beginning of the universe? A story that starts, not with a bang. I'm glad you're here. Wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you feel so inclined, please drop your location and local time in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see where everyone is listening from as the world turns. Before there was soil or sea, before the sun had a place in the sky or the stars knew their courses, there was not simply nothing. The Norse imagination did not conceive of a true sterile void. Instead, there was Ginnungagap. The name itself is a mystery whispered down through the ages, a linguistic puzzle box. Most translated simply as the yawning gap or the gaping abyss, which paints a picture of a colossal empty chasm between worlds. But the old prefix, gin, carried connotations of magic, of illusion and enchantment. This wasn't just an empty space. It was a magically charged void, a place pregnant with possibility, holding its breath in the silence before creation. It was the pause before the first note of music is played, an emptiness that was, paradoxically, full of potential. Imagine a silence so profound it seems to have substance, a darkness so complete it feels like a soft, heavy blanket. This was Ginnungagap. This great, yawning chasm was not alone in the pre-cosmos. It was bordered by two primordial realms, two opposing forces whose existence defined the edges of reality. To the south lay Muspelheim, the land of fire. This was not the comforting fire of a hearth, but a realm of pure, destructive, and creative energy. It was a place of roaring infernos, of rivers of molten rock that flowed with a terrible, slow light, and of air that shimmered with unbearable heat. Sparks and embers, like swarms of fiery insects, danced perpetually in its searing winds. Ruling over this incandescent wasteland was a being named Surtur, a giant of immense power who existed before any of the gods, waiting with his flaming sword for the end of time. His presence was a constant, low hum of heat against the southern edge of Ginnungagap, a promise of light and eventual destruction. To the north, in perfect opposition, lay the realm of Niflheim, the world of mist and ice. If Muspelheim was a scream of energy, Niflheim was a profound, crushing silence. It was a landscape of eternal frost, of glaciers that groaned under their own impossible weight, and of a thick, swirling fog that obscured all things. The air here was so cold it didn't just bite, it seemed to leach the very warmth from existence itself. At the heart of Niflheim was a great spring, Vergelmir, the bubbling, boiling spring, from which 11 great rivers flowed. These were the Ilivagar, the ice waves, as these venomous cold rivers poured out of Niflheim and into the northern reaches of Ginnungagap. The frigid air of the void instantly froze them. The water, thick with a poisonous yeast called Eitr, did not freeze into clear, simple ice. It formed layers of rime, a delicate, feathery frost that built upon itself over uncountable ages. Layer upon layer, the northern part of the gaping void filled with this immense, growing mass of ice, mist, and frozen poison creeping ever southward. And so the stage was set. In the south, the blistering, life-giving heat of Muspelheim, its fiery winds pushing northward. In the north, the soul-crushing cold of Niflheim, its glaciers and rime ice spreading southward. And in the middle, the vast, magically potent stillness of Ginnungagap. For an eternity, these two forces existed in a state of tense equilibrium, one pushing, the other growing, held apart by the sheer scale of the void. But nothing, not even a cosmic stalemate, lasts forever. The warm winds blowing from Muspelheim finally reached the edges of the encroaching ice. It was not a violent collision, no grand explosion that shattered the silence. It was something far more gentle, far more elemental. The hot air, filled with the sparks of Surtur's domain, began to caress the surface of the frozen rime. And the ice, for the first time, began to yield. A great thaw commenced. The meeting of these two extremes, the fire that burns and the frost that bites, created a third state, water. Drop by drop, the hoarfrost began to melt. In the immense, silent theater of Ginnungagap, a new sound was heard. The soft, rhythmic dripping of water falling from the melting ice into the void below. This was the first act of creation. It wasn't a word spoken by a deity or a deliberate act of cosmic construction. It was a simple, chemical reaction on an unimaginable scale, a gentle consequence of heat meeting cold. These drops, falling through the magically charged air of the gap, began to coalesce, to gather, to quicken. The poison yeast of the Elevagar, freed from the ice and warmed by the southern winds, gave this primordial water a strange, life-giving property. The drips became a pool, and within that pool of melted rime, something began to stir. The raw life force, a concept the Norse called Megin, was coalescing. The silence was ending. Life, in a form both monstrous and magnificent, was taking shape in the heart of the yawning void. The water drops, born from the gentle truce between Muspelheim's fire and Niflheim's ice, did not simply pool in the great void. They carried within them the venomous, vibrant yeast of the Elevagar. And this substance, a kind of raw, chaotic life force, began to quicken. The drops gathered and clung to one another in the magically charged air of Ginnungagap, and slowly, over an age of dripping and coalescing, a shape began to form. It was not sculpted or born, but rather congealed into being, like frost forming on a windowpane, but on a scale that defied comprehension. The shape was humanoid, a colossal figure taking form in the gloom. This was Ymir, the first being in existence, whose name means screamer or twin. He was the progenitor of all the Jutnar, the beings we have come to call giants. These early giants were not necessarily evil, not in the way we understand it. They were forces of nature, as unpredictable as an earthquake, as vast and morally neutral as a glacier. Ymir was chaos given form, a creature of rime and mist and untamed cosmic energy, and as he gained consciousness, he was utterly alone and consumed by a fathomless hunger. Creation, having brought forth a mouth, now needed to provide sustenance. From the same primordial Thor that had formed Ymir, another being began to take shape. As more ice melted, the water gathered into the form of a great, hornless cow, an immense creature, white with the frost that birthed her. Her name was Audhumla, the rich, hornless cow, and she was the great nourisher, the cosmic mother of the void. From her massive udders flowed not one, but 4 rivers of pure, rich milk, and these rivers poured directly to Ymir, slaking his thirst and filling his hunger, while Ymir drank his fill from this endless supply. Audhumla, too, needed to eat. She turned her head to the great fields of rime ice that still filled the northern void, the very same ice that had birthed them both. The ice was salty, and she began to lick it, her great, rough tongue rasping against the frozen blocks, seeking the salt and minerals trapped within. This simple, instinctual act of the cosmic cow would change the fate of the universe. It is a recurring theme in these old tales, a grand event set in motion by a seemingly small detail. As Audhumla licked the salt licks, something remarkable happened. On the first day of her licking, as evening fell, the hair of a man appeared, emerging from the surface of the ice block. On the second day, her persistent tongue had worked its way further, revealing the man's entire head. And by the end of the third day, the whole of him was freed from his icy prison. He was handsome, strong, and powerful, and his name was Buri, meaning the producer or the father. He was the first of a new kind of being, separate from the chaotic lineage of Ymir. While the story does not tell us how Buri survived in the void, it is from him that the race of the gods, the Aesir, would eventually spring. This entire process of creation is a fascinating historical puzzle. The figure of Ymir is a classic example of what scholars call a cosmogonic being, a primordial entity whose body is eventually used to create the world. This isn't a uniquely Norse idea. In ancient Hindu texts, the cosmos is formed from the dismembered body of the cosmic man, Purusha. In Mesopotamian myth, the heavens and earth are made from the corpse of the dragon goddess Tiamat. The existence of this archetype across so many unconnected cultures raises a profound question. Is this a coincidental pattern, or does it point to a much older, shared Proto-Indo-European creation story, a kind of mythological ancestor whose story has been scattered and retold in countless different ways? The idea of the world being born from the sacrifice or destruction of a first being seems to be a deeply embedded part of the human psyche's attempt to make sense of existence. While Buri was being slowly uncovered by the patient work of Audhumla, Ymir the giant was also creating life, though in a much stranger, more elemental fashion. As he slept, fattened and content from the rivers of milk, the vital heat within his enormous body caused him to sweat, and from the moist pit of his left arm, a male and a female giant were born, fully formed. They were the first of his children, born not of love or will, but as a simple, strange, biological byproduct of his existence. As if this weren't peculiar enough, his legs then began to stir and interact with one another, and from this union of his own limbs, a monstrous son with 6 heads was born. In this way, without a partner, the entire race of frost giants, the chaotic and formidable Jutnar, sprang into being directly from Ymir's slumbering form, and so the vast quiet emptiness of Ginnungagap was now populated. There were 2 distinct families, 2 lineages born from the same primordial Thor, but fundamentally different in nature. On one side, there was Ymir and his brood of frost giants, chaotic, elemental, and strange, born from sweat and the rubbing of legs. On the other, there was Buri, the ancestor of the gods, uncovered from the ice by a gentle, nourishing cow. These two clans now coexisted in the misty void, sustained by the same 4 rivers of milk, their destinies already set on a collision course. Buri would eventually have a son of his own, named Bor, who in turn would take a wife from among the giants. And their children, the first true gods, would look upon the immense, sleeping form of Ymir, not with reverence for their fellow inhabitant of the void, but with the cold, hard eyes of architects seeing a mountain of raw material, waiting to be carved into a new and orderly world. The age of dripping ice was over. An age of blood and creation was about to begin. The ancestor of the gods, Buri, who had been licked from the salty ice by the great cow Audhumla, was not idle in the void. He fathered a son whose name was Bor. In the first great mingling of the 2 primordial lines, Bor looked upon the daughters of the giants and took one for his wife. Her name was Bestla, a daughter of the Jotun Bulthorn, and from their union, the first generation of true gods was born. There were 3 brothers, and their names spoke of the qualities they would bring to the unformed cosmos. The first and greatest was Odin, whose name is tied to concepts of spirit, fury, and poetic inspiration. The second was Vili, whose name simply means will or desire, the conscious drive to act and shape the world. The third was Ve, a name connected to the sacred, the hallowed ground, the sanctuary. Together, they were spirit, will, and sanctity, a trinity of conscious ordering principles, born into a world still dominated by the vast, slumbering, and mindlessly procreating form of the giant Ymir. For a time, they all coexisted in the misty expanse of Ginnungagap. But the brothers, filled with a new kind of purpose, saw the endless chaotic spawning of giants from Ymir's body as a threat to the very possibility of a stable reality. They looked upon the snoring, sweating progenitor and his brood, and they saw not life, but a form of cosmic inertia, a reality that could never become more than what it was. For a true world to be built, a world with meaning, with order, with a sky and a sea, and a place for beings to live deliberately, the raw material of creation had to be reclaimed. They came to a momentous and terrible decision. Ymir, the first being, the ancestor of all giants, had to be unmade. This was no simple act of violence. It was a cosmic deconstruction. The 3 brothers, Odin, Vili, and Ve, approached the immense sleeping form. The ensuing struggle was the first war, a battle that shook the foundations of the void. It was the focused, intelligent force of the new gods against the raw, elemental, and overwhelming power of the first giant. Though the sagas are quiet on the details of the fight, the outcome was inevitable. The principles of order, will, and spirit overcame the principle of chaos. They slew Ymir, and in his final, agonized moments, the screaming that gave him his name echoed through the abyss. From his countless wounds, a torrent of blood, the salty, venomous water of the Elivagar from which he was formed, gushed forth in an unimaginable deluge. The flood of Ymir's blood was so vast and so sudden that it filled the entirety of Ginnungagap. It was a red, primordial sea that rose and drowned the entire race of frost giants that had spawned from his strange sleep. They were all swept away in the gore of their own ancestor, a generation of chaotic beings washed from existence before it had truly begun. All, that is, except for one family. Ymir's grandson, a giant named Bergelmir, was wise enough to see the coming doom. He quickly found a looter, an object of great scholarly debate that could be a hollowed-out log, a simple boat, or perhaps even a coffin-like chest, and climbed aboard with his wife. They floated upon the horrifying sea of blood, the sole survivors of the first apocalypse, eventually coming to rest on a distant shore. From this pair, a new race of giants would descend, hardened by this memory and filled with an eternal, burning hatred for the gods who had murdered their forefather. The cosmic war was not over. It had merely been given its defining grievance. When the bloody tide receded, Odin and his brothers were left with the colossal corpse of Ymir, a mountain of raw potential in the center of the now empty void. They were no longer just warriors. They were architects, sculptors, and craftsmen on a divine scale. Hoisting the immense body, they carried it to the very middle of Ginnungagap to begin their great work. From Ymir's flesh, they fashioned the soils and lands of the world, packing it down to form the plains and valleys. His unbroken bones they heaved into place to create the mountains and the high stony cliffs. His teeth and the countless shattered fragments of his skeleton, they scattered across the lands to become the rocks, stones, and pebbles of the earth. The remaining blood from his body they gathered into the deep places to form the oceans, and they coiled this great sea around the entire world like a vast encircling serpent. They lifted his magnificent skull, vast enough to contain all of creation, and set it high above the earth to form the firmament, the dome of the heavens. To ensure it would never fall, they appointed 4 dwarves, whose origins are another of the mythology's great mysteries, to hold up the 4 corners of the sky. Their names were Nordri, Sudri, Ostri, and Vestri, and they became the living embodiments of the 4 cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west. Not a single piece of the giant was wasted. Ymir's brain they tossed into the air beneath the skull dome, where it drifted and billowed to become all the clouds that move across the sky. With the land, sea, and sky in place, the brothers took the final leftover sparks and glowing embers that still drifted north from the fiery realm of Muspelheim. They set these lights into the heavens, some fixed in place, others given paths and orbits, creating the sun, the moon, and all the stars. They ordained their cycles, bringing the concepts of day and night, seasons and years, into being for the first time. The world was now illuminated, but it was also vulnerable. From the distant shores where Bergelmir had landed, the race of giants would eventually rise again. As a final act of construction and defense, the gods took the long, thick eyebrows of Ymir and used them to build a great fortified wall around the central part of the world, the most temperate and pleasant lands. This protected realm, this enclosure, they named Midgard, the Middle Earth. The cold, harsh lands on the outer shores, beyond the great ocean, were given to the giants and became known as Jotunheim, the land of giants. The cosmos now had shape and structure. Chaos had been slain and repurposed into a world of mountains, seas, and stars, a grand and beautiful stage awaiting the arrival of its principal actors. The world, now carved from the body of the first giant, was a place of stark and silent beauty. The mountains stood sharp against the new sky, their peaks formed from the knuckles and joints of Ymir. The oceans, once his blood, ebbed and flowed in a soft, rhythmic sigh against the shores of the land made from his flesh. Clouds, once the substance of his brain, drifted lazily beneath the great dome of his skull, where the captured sparks of Muspelheim glittered as stars. Odin and his brothers had created a masterpiece of cosmic engineering, a perfectly ordered stage within the protective walls of Midgard. But it was an empty stage. The winds blew over plains where no grass yet grew. The rivers flowed through valleys where no creatures drank, and the sun shone down upon a world that had no one to feel its warmth. It was a magnificent house with no one living inside, a grand poem with no one to hear it. This profound silence in the heart of their new creation spurred the gods to one final intimate act of artistry. The three divine brothers. And here the old stories offer a fascinating contradiction, a historical mystery woven into the very fabric of the myth, walked along the endless, lonely coastline of their new world. In the telling of Ymir's demise, the brothers were Odin, Vili, and Ve. But in the oldest poem that speaks of humanity's origin, the Völuspá, Odin walks with two different companions, Hönir and Lodr. Perhaps they are the same beings known by other names, a common occurrence in these tales, or perhaps a different tradition has been preserved here, a thread from another tapestry. This ambiguity reminds us that we are listening to a collection of whispers carried down through time, not a single monolithic report. Whoever they were, these three gods walked by the sea, their task of world-building seemingly complete, yet sensing a fundamental absence. There on the sand, washed up by the tide, they found two lifeless things, two pieces of driftwood, bleached by the sun and scoured smooth by the waves. They were without fate, without purpose, inert and powerless. One was a log from an ash tree, the other a log from what was likely an elm tree, or perhaps a vine. They were nothing more than the sea's cast-offs, but the gods, in their infinite wisdom, saw not what the logs were, but what they could become. They stopped and gathered around these humble pieces of wood and prepared to bestow upon them the gifts that would define the essence of our own existence. They named the ash log Ask and the elm log Embla and began their work. First, the greatest of them, Odin, the All-Father, stepped forward. He bent down and gave the first and most essential gift. He breathed into the cold, unmoving wood and gave them end. This is a word that means more than just breath. It is soul, spirit, the animating principle itself. In that moment, the wood ceased to be wood. It warmed, softened, and transformed into living flesh. Two still, silent bodies now lay on the sand, no longer logs, but not yet truly alive. They had form, but no consciousness. Then the second god, the mysterious Hönir, a figure often associated with indecision in other tales, but here, a giver of a profound gift, stepped forward. He touched them and granted them Odiar. This is another powerful, complex word, a cognate of Odin's own name. It signifies the inner world, mind, consciousness, sense, and inspiration. It is the capacity for thought, the ability to reason, to feel joy and sorrow, love and anger. It is the wild, ecstatic inspiration of the poet and the furious rage of the warrior. With this gift, their eyes, though still closed, could now potentially see. Their minds, though still blank, could now potentially think. They were no longer just breathing statues. They were thinking beings, capable of an inner life. Finally, the third god, the even more enigmatic Lodr, completed the transformation. Scholars have long debated his identity, with some powerfully arguing that his association with life-giving warmth and a ruddy complexion makes him none other than Loki, the trickster god, in a more benevolent, creative guise. Lodr bestowed upon the couple two final gifts. He gave them La Og Leti, which can be understood as the warmth of living blood, the senses, and perhaps even speech, and he gave them Lito Goda, a good and healthy complexion, the outward appearance of vitality. He connected their new inner worlds to the physical realm. With his touch, their blood began to course with warmth. Their eyes opened to the light of the sun. Their ears heard the sound of the sea for the first time, and their skin felt the breeze. Usk and Embla stood up from the sand, the first man and woman, complete and whole. They were no longer driftwood, fated to be tossed about by the waves, but were now the masters of their own destiny, endowed with spirit, a conscious mind, and a vital living body. They were both of the world, made from its trees, and yet separate, gifted with a divine spark that set them apart. The gods gave them all of Midgard as their home and their domain, a safe land circled by the sea and protected by the impassable walls made from Ymir's brows. From this first pair, all the nations and families of humankind would descend. The silence of the world was finally broken, not by the roar of giants or the clash of cosmic forces, but by the quiet, steady sound of two human hearts beating in the center of creation. The great stage was no longer empty. The story could truly begin. With the world of Midgard now home to Usk and Embla and their descendants, the cosmos required a structure to hold it all together. The new reality, the land of humans, the realms of the gods and giants, and the primordial worlds of fire and ice, was not a collection of separate, disconnected islands floating in the void. They were all part of a single, immense, and living architecture, bound together by a central pillar that was both the axis of the universe and a conscious entity in itself. This was Yggdrasil, the world tree. It was an ash tree of such impossible scale that its existence defied mortal comprehension. Its trunk rose through the very center of all things, a living column that provided stability and connection. Its highest branches soared up through the heavens, past the sun and moon, and spread out to form a canopy over Asgard itself, the home of the gods. From its evergreen leaves, a fine, sweet dew constantly fell, gathering on the earth below to become the honey that nourished the world's bees. The name Yggdrasil is a poem in itself, a key to understanding the relationship between the tree and the greatest of the gods. Ygr, meaning the terrible one, was one of the many names of Odin. Trasil means a horse, or more accurately, the steed one rides. Yggdrasil, therefore, is Odin's horse. This is not because he literally rode it, but because it served as his gallows in a profound act of self-sacrifice. In a story we shall visit later, Odin hung himself from a great branch of this tree for 9 nights, piercing his own side with a spear, effectively riding the tree between life and death in order to gain the secret knowledge of the runes. The tree is thus intimately connected to wisdom, sacrifice, and the very magic that underpins reality. This colossal tree was held in place by 3 enormous roots that stretched out to the furthest corners of existence, each one anchoring the cosmos and drawing nourishment from a sacred, mystical well. The first and most important root reached into the celestial realm, into Asgard itself. Beneath this root lay the holiest of all places, the well of Urda, the source of all fate. Here, by the side of the well, sat 3 enigmatic female figures known as the Norns. Their names were Urda, which means what has become, or the past; Verdandi, what is becoming, or the present; and Skuld, what shall be, or the future. These were not goddesses who could be worshipped or swayed by prayer. They were the weavers of destiny, spinning the threads of life for every god, human, giant, and dwarf. Not even Odin could alter the fate they wove. Every day, these three Norns would perform a vital task. They would draw water from the sacred well and mix it with the clay from its banks, creating a life-giving paste, which they would then smear onto the roots of Yggdrasil, healing any wounds and preventing the great tree from ever rotting or withering. The second great root stretched far across the cosmos into Jotunheim, the land of the giants. Deep beneath this root lay another spring, the well of Mimir. This well was the source of all cosmic intelligence and wisdom. Every secret, every piece of forgotten knowledge, every insight into the workings of the universe was contained within its crystalline waters. It was guarded by a mysterious and ancient being, Mimir himself, whose name means the Rememberer. He was so wise that even Odin, the All-Father, would one day travel here, seeking a single drink from the well to increase his knowledge. And Mimir would demand a terrible price for it, one of the god's own eyes. The third and final route plunged deep down into the cold, dark mists of Niflheim, the primordial realm of ice that existed at the beginning of all things. This root drew its life from the spring called Vergelmir, the bubbling cauldron, the very same source from which the 11 venomous Elevaga rivers had once flowed to create Yggdrasil's ancient ancestor, the giant Ymir. This root connected the living, vibrant world of the present directly back to the chaotic, formless state of the distant past. This concept of a cosmic tree or a central world pillar is a fascinating piece of historical and anthropological mystery, while Yggdrasil is uniquely Norse in its details. The fundamental idea of an axis mundi, a vertical axis connecting the heavens, the earth, and the underworld, is found in cultures all across the world. In particular, it resonates strongly with the shamanic traditions of Siberia and the Eurasian steppes. For these peoples, the world tree was not just a map of the cosmos, but a ladder. It was believed that a shaman in a deep trance could travel up or down the trunk of this spiritual tree to visit the land of the gods or the realm of the spirits. It is entirely possible that the story of Yggdrasil is a distant echo of these ancient shamanic practices, a mythological remnant of a time when spiritual leaders rode the tree not as a gallows, but as a pathway for the soul's journey. Yggdrasil was no static monument. It was a teeming, living ecosystem in a constant state of dynamic tension. In its highest branches, where the winds of the cosmos whistled, sat a great and wise eagle who saw and knew much of what transpired in the 9 worlds. Between the eagle's eyes perched a hawk named Vedifölnir, observing all with an even keener sight. At the tree's base, gnawing ceaselessly on the root that extended into Niflheim, lived a dreadful dragon serpent named Nidugga, the malice striker. He was the embodiment of the destructive forces that sought to unravel creation, constantly chewing on the tree's foundation. To make matters worse, a nimble, mischievous squirrel named Ratatoska, or Drilltooth, spent all his days running up and down the enormous trunk. He was a cosmic agent of discord, carrying insulting messages and gossip from the great eagle at the top, down to the dragon Nidhugga at the bottom, and carrying the dragon's hateful replies back up again, ensuring that the two were always in a state of mutual animosity. Yggdrasil was thus held together, not by peace, but by a delicate balance of opposing forces. a living symbol of a universe that thrived on struggle. Its very existence was a constant cycle of damage and healing, a testament to the Norse belief that life is not a state of placid being, but a perpetual, beautiful, and ultimately doomed fight against the forces of decay. High in the upper branches of the great world tree, Yggdrasil, bathed in a light purer than anything known in the mortal world, lay the fortress home of the gods, Asgard. This was the realm of the Aesir, the clan of gods descended from Odin, and it was a world built on principles of order, strength, and divine purpose. If Midgard was the sprawling, beautiful, and unpredictable home given to humanity, Asgard was the celestial citadel, the command center from which the gods watched over the 9 worlds and stood guard against the ever-present threat of chaos. It was a realm of impossible architecture, of halls roofed with shimmering gold and polished silver that caught the light of the stars. Between these divine halls lay the great green plain of Idavöllr, the splendor plain, where the gods would meet to hold council, to compete in games of strength and wit, and to prepare for the battles they knew must one day be fought. To reach this sublime realm, one could not simply climb. The only path into Asgard was a bridge of breathtaking and perilous beauty, a structure known as Bifrost. To mortal eyes, it appeared as a simple rainbow, a fleeting arc of color in the sky after a storm. But in truth, it was a solid, shimmering causeway, built from fire, air, and water, its colors shifting and burning with an inner heat. This heat was its primary defense, for the bridge was intensely hot to the touch, enough to scorch the feet of any frost giant or unwelcome creature that might dare to attempt a crossing. This ethereal bridge served as the ultimate gated community, connecting the world of the gods to the world of men, yet ensuring that only those who were worthy could ever hope to enter. At the very heart of Asgard, the undisputed ruler was the complex and formidable figure of Odin. He was the All-Father, the chief of the Aesir, yet he was no simple king who sat comfortably on his throne. He was a god of 1,000 contradictions, a god of war who delighted in strategy and conflict, but also the god of poetry and wisdom who would sacrifice anything for knowledge. He was often depicted as a grey-bearded older man, typically wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a cloak to hide his most distinguishing feature. He had only one eye, having traded the other for a drink from Mimir's well of wisdom. As we shall see, from his high seat, Lidskjalf, he could look out and see everything that happened in all of the 9 worlds. And to aid his endless quest for information, he had 2 raven companions, Hugin, whose name means thought, and Munin, memory. Every morning, he would send them out to fly across the worlds, and every evening, they would return to perch on his shoulders and whisper into his ears all the news they had seen and heard. By Odin's side ruled his wife, the powerful and dignified queen of Asgard, Frigg. She was the goddess of marriage, fertility, and the household, a figure of serene and knowing grace. She possessed the gift of prophecy and was said to know the destiny of every being in the cosmos. Yet she was famously reticent, rarely speaking of the future she foresaw. Her private hall was Fenrir, the Fen Halls, a place of peace and quiet contemplation, a tranquil counterpoint to the more martial halls of her husband and son. That son was Thor, perhaps the most famous and beloved of all the Aesir. While Odin was the god of kings and poets, Thor was the champion of the common man. He was the god of thunder, his chariot pulled by 2 goats, Tungrisnir, and Tungenjoster, causing the roar of thunder as it rolled across the clouds. He was immense in his strength, with a fiery red beard and an equally fiery temperament, possessing a straightforward and honest nature. He was the protector of both Asgard and Midgard, his greatest weapon being the dwarf-forged hammer Mjolnir, which would always return to his hand after being thrown. But where did the stories of these magnificent beings come from? Is it possible that the gods themselves were not always divine? A fascinating and enduring hypothesis, one promoted by the great Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson, who wrote down many of these tales, is a concept called euhemerism. This is the idea that myths may have their roots in genuine historical events, and that gods may have originally been powerful human heroes or kings whose legends grew over centuries of retelling. Snorri himself proposed that Odin was not a god from the beginning, but a great and powerful human sorcerer king from a city in Asia called Asgard. He suggested that as this king and his people, the Aesir, a name uncannily similar to Asia, migrated north into Scandinavia, their technological, military, and magical prowess was so great that the native peoples began to worship them as gods. Over generations, the memory of the human king was transformed into the myth of the divine All-Father. It is a compelling thought that the gods on their golden thrones might just be the ultimate superhero versions of real human ancestors, their stories magnified by time into cosmic epics. The divine family of Asgard was vast and varied. There was the beautiful Balder, son of Odin and Frigg, the god of light and purity, so beloved that all of creation wept at his passing. There was Tyr, the god of law and justice, the bravest of all, who sacrificed his own hand in the jaws of the monstrous wolf Fenrir to save his fellow gods. And there was Bragi, the silver-tongued god of poetry, and his wife Idun, the goddess of youth, who kept the golden apples that prevented the gods from ever growing old. All of these figures, and many more, lived in a state of glorious, if precarious splendor. They feasted, they fought, they governed the worlds from their magnificent home, a shining beacon of order at the top of creation. But even here, in the halls of the gods, the threads of fate woven by the Norns could not be escaped, and the hatred of the giants festered in the world below, a promise of a final terrible reckoning. For all their might and majesty, the Aesir gods of Asgard were not the only divine family to exist in the cosmos. In a separate realm known as Vanaheim, a place whose location is one of the great lost secrets of the 9 worlds, lived another tribe of deities, the Vanir. Where the Aesir were primarily gods of power, law, war, and the sky, the Vanir were deities of the earth and the sea. They were gods of fertility and cultivation, of prosperity and peace, of the bounty of the harvest and the wealth of the oceans. They were also the undisputed masters of a potent and mysterious form of magic known as Siddhar, a practice involving prophecy and the shaping of fate, which was considered somewhat unmanly for male practitioners, but was a source of immense power. For a long time, the 2 tribes of gods existed in parallel, aware of each other, but separate, each sovereign in their own domain. The most prominent of the Vanir were the family of Njörður, a gentle and beloved god of the sea, the winds, and the wealth that comes from successful sea voyages. He was a being of peace who could calm the fiercest storms and quell the wildest fires with his presence. He had 2 children, twins who would become even more famous than their father, Freya and Freya. Freya was the god of sunshine, fair weather, and the life-giving rains that ensured a good harvest. He was a god of virility and prosperity, and it was said that no war or strife could exist in any land where he was truly worshipped. His sister, Freya, was a goddess of breathtaking complexity. She was the embodiment of love, beauty, lust, and desire, but she was also a fierce warrior goddess. It was Freya who first brought the practice of cider magic to the gods, and she was its most skilled practitioner. In a fascinating arrangement, she also claimed half of all warriors slain in battle, bringing them to a great hall in Vanaheim, Sessrumnir, the Hall of Many Seats, while Odin claimed the other half for Valhalla. The golden age of peace between the two divine tribes was shattered by the arrival in Asgard of a mysterious Vanir figure named Gullveig. Her name can be translated as gold power or gold greed, and her presence had a corrupting influence on the Aesir. She spoke of nothing but gold, and her insatiable lust for the precious metal began to infect the hearts of the Asgardian gods, turning their minds toward avarice and away from nobler pursuits. Disgusted and horrified by this spiritual sickness she had introduced, the Aesir seized her. 3 times they threw her into the great fire in the center of their hall, and 3 times she was reborn from the ashes, purer and more beautiful than before, her lust for gold undiminished. When news of this violent and inhospitable treatment of one of their own reached the Vanir, they were enraged. They swore vengeance for the attack, and thus began the first war in the history of the world. The Aesir-Vanir War was a conflict of devastating and equal measure. The Aesir had the advantage in conventional warfare. They were master strategists with superior weapons, and Odin's great spear, Gungnir, never missed its mark. But the Vanir wielded their powerful magic, the enchanting and mind-bending art of cider, which the Aesir warriors had no defense against. They cast spells that confused their enemies, weakened their resolve, and shattered their defenses. For the first time, the mighty walls of Asgard were breached by an invading force. The war raged across the worlds, but neither side could gain a final, decisive victory. Every advantage won by the Aesir's strength was countered by the Vanir's sorcery. This entire mythological conflict has long been a source of fascination for historians, who see in it the faint echo of a real historical event. One prominent theory suggests that this story is a social charter myth, a narrative created to explain and justify the merging of 2 distinct, real-world cultures in ancient Scandinavia. In this view, the myth reflects a time when a migrating or invading people who worshipped warrior sky gods, the Aesir, came into conflict with the established indigenous people of the land who worshipped local earth and sea fertility deities, the Vanir. After a period of conflict, the 2 cultures would have eventually merged, integrating their societies and their pantheons. The story of the war, the stalemate, and the eventual peaceful truce would then serve as a divine precedent, a sacred story that explained to a unified people why their belief system included both the fierce warrior Odin and the peaceful harvest god Freya. The myth, in this light, is not just a fantasy. It is the poetic memory of a profound social transformation, realizing that their endless war would only lead to the mutual ruin of both divine families. The Aesir and the Vanir finally met on the field of battle to declare a truce. To ensure the peace would be a lasting one, they agreed to an exchange of their most honored members. The Vanir sent their very best. Njörður and his 2 children, Freya and Freya, went to live in Asgard. They were welcomed with great honor, and they quickly became essential and beloved members of the Asgardian court. Their knowledge of fertility and magic rounding out the Aesir's own strengths. In return, the Aesir sent 2 of their own to Vanaheim. The first was Hönir, the same god who helped give consciousness to the first humans. He was a tall, handsome, and imposing figure, and the Aesir assured the Vanir he would make a fine chieftain. The second was the ancient and incredibly wise being, Mimir, whose knowledge was unparalleled. The arrangement, however, quickly soured. The Vanir made Hönir their new leader, but they soon discovered that he was utterly useless without Mimir by his side. Whenever Mimir was not present to advise him, Hönir would offer no opinion of his own, simply saying, "Let others decide." The Vanir felt they had been cheated in the exchange, receiving a handsome but worthless puppet instead of a capable leader. In a grim and brutal act of retaliation, they seized Mimir, beheaded him, and sent his head back to Asgard as a message to Odin. But Odin, refusing to lose such a source of wisdom, took the head, embalmed it with special herbs to prevent it from decaying, and chanted magical spells over it. Mimir's head was reanimated, and it continued to speak to Odin, revealing to him countless secrets and hidden knowledge from the other worlds. Though born of a brutal act, this event cemented the truce. The war was over. The 2 tribes of gods were now one, their strengths combined, their families forever intertwined through this violent, tragic, and ultimately successful peace. The union of the Aesir and the Vanir brought a new era of stability and strength to Asgard, but it did little to quell the restless heart of its king. Odin, the All-Father, was a being defined not by contentment, but by a profound and insatiable hunger for knowledge. The acquisition of Mimir's severed head, which he kept and consulted for its wisdom, was not an end to his quest, but merely a confirmation that there were deeper wells of understanding to be found in the cosmos. He knew that the head's counsel was but a reflection of its source, the true font of all cosmic memory, which lay deep in the land of the giants, beneath the root of the great world tree, Yggdrasil. While his fellow gods might feast in their golden halls and celebrate their hard-won peace, Odin was consumed by the vastness of his own ignorance. He knew that to rule the 9 worlds, he must first understand them, and to understand them, he would have to make a journey to their very foundation, and so he prepared for a pilgrimage. This was not a quest of war, requiring armies and grand strategy. It was a deeply personal journey into enemy territory, undertaken not for conquest, but for enlightenment. He shed his regal form as the king of Asgard and took on his favorite disguise, that of a simple, grey-cloaked wanderer, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. Alone, leaning on a staff, he left the shimmering safety of the Bifrost Bridge behind and made his way into Jotunheim. He traveled through the harsh, cold lands of his ancient enemies, a landscape of jagged mountains and frozen rivers, his solitary figure moving with a quiet purpose that belied the gravity of his mission. His destination was the second root of Yggdrasil and the dark, quiet spring that bubbled beneath it, Mimisbrunner, the Well of Mimir. He found the well in a silent ancient grove. It was not a grand or ornate place. It was a simple, dark pool of water, so still it seemed to be made of polished obsidian. But looking into its depths was not like looking at a reflection. The surface did not show the sky or the branches of the great ash tree above. Instead, it seemed to contain them. Within its waters swirled the memory of everything that had ever been. One could see the echoes of Ginnungagap, the forming of Ymir, the birth of stars, and the weaving of fates. To drink from this water was not to learn a fact, but to absorb existence itself. Guarding this sacred place was the ancient being Mimir, the Rememberer, a Jotun of immense wisdom who had existed long before the first gods. In this telling of the tale, we see him whole and hale, the warden of this holy place before the tragic end of the Aesir-Vanir war. Odin, the king of all gods, stood before the ancient giant, no longer a king, but a humble supplicant. He asked for a single drink from the well. Mimir, whose wisdom came from the well itself, looked at the one-eyed god and understood the true weight of the request. He knew the secrets the water held and knew that such knowledge could not be given freely. The cosmos demands balance. A gift of such magnitude required a sacrifice of equal value. He looked upon the All-Father and asked the question that would forever define Odin's character. What will you give me for this drink, Odin? I know where your eye is hidden. In some versions, Mimir already knows the price, and in others, his question forces Odin to choose. But the outcome is always the same. The price could not be paid in gold, for the well held the memory of all the gold ever mined. It could not be paid with power, for the well contained the secrets of power itself. The price for this knowledge had to be a part of the seeker himself. The sacrifice of a physical attribute for spiritual power is a profound and recurring theme in the Norse world. It speaks to a belief that true wisdom is not gained by mere observation, but by ordeal. The eye is the organ of literal external sight. To sacrifice it is to willingly give up a part of one's ability to perceive the surface of the world in exchange for the ability to comprehend its hidden inner workings. This can be seen as a distant echo of ancient shamanic rituals, in which a prospective shaman would undergo a symbolic death and rebirth, often involving a physical ordeal or mutilation to open their inner eye to the spirit world. Odin's act is the ultimate shamanic initiation. Without hesitation, Odin paid the price. He reached up to his own face and gouged out his left eye. He did not cry out or flinch, for this was no act of violence, but a willed and necessary transaction. He dropped the living eye into the dark, placid water of the well. It sank slowly, coming to rest on the bottom, where it would remain for all of time, a permanent pledge to the pursuit of knowledge. Mimir's own eye in the well now had a companion, and Odin's offering was accepted. The giant then filled the great Gjallarhorn, which in this context serves as a drinking horn, with the well's sacred water, and offered it to the now one-eyed god. Odin drank, and the universe flooded into him. He was filled with a knowledge so vast and so terrible that it would have shattered any lesser mind. He saw the intricate patterns the Norns wove at the base of Yggdrasil, and understood not just the past and present, but the inevitable future. He saw the secret meaning of the runes, the magical symbols that governed reality. And most terribly, he saw the end of all things. He saw the coming of Fimbulwinter, the betrayal of Loki, the death of his beloved son Balder, and the final cataclysmic battle of Ragnarok, where he himself was fated to be devoured by the wolf Fenrir. The wisdom he gained was not a comfort. It was a profound and sorrowful burden. He now knew, with absolute certainty, the doom that awaited him and all he had built. He returned to Asgard, a changed god, his single eye now burning with a new, terrifying intensity. He had gained the wisdom he sought, but lost his innocence forever. This knowledge would now shape his every action, driving him in a long, desperate, and ultimately hopeless struggle against a fate that he, and he alone, could see with perfect clarity. While Odin, the one-eyed king, walked a lonely and labyrinthine path in his pursuit of esoteric knowledge, the security of the nine worlds rested on the shoulders of a very different kind of god. If Odin was the mind and the spirit of Asgard, his son Thor was its fist and its heart. He was the champion of both gods and mortals, a being of immense power and uncomplicated conviction. Where his father saw the world in shades of grey, full of secrets to be unraveled and schemes to be woven, Thor saw it in stark and simple terms. There was the realm of order, Asgard and Midgard, and there was the realm of chaos, Jotunheim. There were the folk who needed protecting, and there were the giants who needed smashing. His purpose was not to understand the world's sorrowful destiny, but to stand as an unbreakable shield against it for as long as he possibly could. Thor was a god of tremendous appetites and a famously short temper, his rage as sudden and as violent as the summer storms he commanded. His presence was a reassuring rumble of thunder in the distance, the sound of his chariot rolling across the sky, pulled by his two magnificent goats, Tangrisnir, Teeth Snarler, and Tangenjoster, Teeth Grinder. He was the son of Odin and Jörd, the personification of the earth itself, making him a unique bridge between the heavens and the mortal soil. His home in Asgard was a great hall called Bilskirnir, the lightning flash, which was the largest single building in the entire divine realm, a fitting home for a god of such immense stature and spirit. He was the protector, the guardian, and the strong right arm of the Aesir. And when a problem arose that could not be solved with words or wisdom, it was Thor's name that was called. His strength, while formidable on its own, was magnified to a cosmic scale by three legendary treasures, three items of power that were as famous as the god himself. The first and most renowned was his hammer, Mjolnir. Its name likely means the crusher, or that which smashes, and it was no ordinary weapon. Forged in the heart of a star by the master dwarf craftsmen, Broca and Itri, its handle was notoriously short due to a mishap during its creation caused by the meddling of Loki. But this flaw did nothing to diminish its power. Mjolnir could level mountains with a single blow, and was the terror of all the giants. It was magically bound to its owner, so that whenever Thor threw it, it would unerringly strike its target and then fly back to his hand. It was not just an instrument of destruction, it was also a tool of blessing and consecration. With Mjolnir, Thor could hallow a marriage, sanctify a boundary, and even bring his own slaughtered goats back to life. This hammer was the ultimate symbol of divine order pushing back against chaos. Even the mighty Thor, however, could not wield Mjolnir's raw power unaided. To handle the hammer's colossal force and searing heat, he required his second treasure, a pair of iron gauntlets known as Jarngreipar. These gloves allowed him to catch the hammer when it returned to him, and to grip its short handle for a truly devastating swing. And to complete his arsenal, he wore his third treasure, a belt of strength called Megingjöd. When this belt was cinched around his waist, his already godlike, immense strength was instantly doubled, making him arguably the most physically powerful being in all the 9 worlds. With these 3 items, the hammer, the gloves, and the belt, Thor was a near invincible force, the ultimate divine warrior. It is a fascinating detail of history that while our surviving written sources, the Eddas and sagas, are often preoccupied with the complex aristocratic figure of Odin, the archaeological record tells a very different story about who was truly the most popular god among the everyday Norse people. Across the entire Viking world, from the British Isles to Russia, from Iceland to the riverbanks of Ukraine, archaeologists have unearthed hundreds upon hundreds of small amulets in the shape of Thor's hammer. These Mjolnir pendants were worn as necklaces by men and women from all walks of life. Far fewer symbols connected to Odin have ever been found. This suggests that for the average farmer worried about his crops, the sailor hoping for safe passage, or the settler moving into a new and dangerous land, it was Thor they looked to. Odin may have been the god of kings and poets, but Thor was the god of the people. He was their guardian, their protector, and in the later centuries, his hammer became a powerful symbol of their faith and cultural identity, a defiant answer to the Christian crosses that were beginning to appear throughout their lands. At home in his great hall, Thor was a family man, married to the beautiful goddess Sif, who was famous for her magnificent golden hair that had been magically spun for her by the dwarves after Loki, in an act of pure malice, had cruelly shorn off her original locks. Together, they had a daughter, Thruder, whose name simply means strength. Thor also had 2 sons, Magni, mighty, and Modi, wrath, who were born of his affair with the giantess. These 2 sons were destined by prophecy to be among the few who would survive the final battle of Ragnarok, and it was to them that the legacy of their father, the mighty hammer Mjolnir, would one day pass. And so Thor lived, a being of thunderous power and unwavering purpose. While his father peered into the future with his one all-seeing eye, burdened by the sorrowful knowledge of a coming doom, Thor stood firmly in the present. He stood as a vigilant watchman on the eastern edge of the world, his red beard bristling in the wind, his iron-gloved hand resting on the handle of his hammer, his gaze fixed firmly on the misty shores of Jotunheim, forever the reassuring and thunderous guardian of the worlds of gods and men. If Thor was the steadfast shield of Asgard, its predictable and righteous protector, then there was another force within the Golden Realm that was his perfect opposite, a being of pure, unpredictable chaos, a walking paradox who was both the gods' most clever savior and their most insidious threat. This was Loki, the trickster, the shapeshifter, the silver-tongued god of cunning and deceit. The greatest dangers to the divine world did not always come from the hulking giants of Jotunheim. Often, the most devastating crises were born from the bored, mischievous, and increasingly malicious mind of the one who ate at their tables, drank their mead, and had been sworn by the most sacred of oaths as the blood brother of Odin himself. Loki's very existence in Asgard was a profound mystery. He was not one of the Aesir, nor one of the Vanir. By birth, he was one of their sworn enemies. His father was the Jotun Farbauti, the cruel striker, and his mother was the enigmatic Laufey, whose name suggests a connection to trees. He was a giant, an outsider, yet he walked freely among the gods in their most sacred halls. His acceptance was due to one single ancient event. Long ago, in the early days of the world, he and Odin had met and performed a ritual, mingling their blood and swearing an oath to be forever blood brothers. Why the wise and cautious All-Father would bind himself to such a creature of chaos is a question that lies at the heart of the Norse worldview. And the answer, perhaps, is that Odin understood a fundamental truth about the cosmos. Order cannot exist without a seed of chaos to test it, to challenge it, and to force it to evolve. Loki was the catalyst, the agent of change in a world that might otherwise grow stagnant. He was handsome, charming, and impossibly persuasive, able to talk his way into and out of any situation. His greatest gift was the power of shapeshifting. He could alter his form and even his gender at will, becoming a salmon, a fly, a falcon, or a mare with equal ease. This physical fluidity was a mirror of his moral fluidity. He was not bound by the Aesir's strict codes of honor, loyalty, or truth. He served only his own whims, his own amusement, and his own survival. In the early days, his schemes often caused immense trouble for the gods, but his cleverness was so great that he almost always managed to resolve the very crises he had created, often leaving the gods better off than they were before. He was the fire that might burn down your house, but he was also the fire that could forge for you a magical treasure. This fundamental ambiguity is the great puzzle of Loki. He is not a simple villain, not a straightforward force of evil. He is the necessary friction in the cosmic machine. It was Loki's theft and mischief that directly led to the creation of the gods' most precious artifacts: Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, Odin's spear, Gungnir, the golden-bristled bow of Freya, and Sif's magical golden hair were all acquired as part of the elaborate apologies Loki was forced to make for his transgressions. Without his chaos, the gods would have been weaker, less equipped. He was the problem maker and the problem solver, the poison, and occasionally the cure. He represents the uncomfortable reality that progress and invention are often born from crisis and instability. His dual nature was perfectly reflected in the two families he fathered. In Asgard, he had a wife, the kind and incredibly loyal Sigyn. She stood by him through everything, and with her, he had two sons, Vali and Narfi. This was his Asgardian family, the anchor that tied him, however loosely, to the world of the gods. But in secret, he crept away to Jotunheim, and there, with a fearsome giantess named Angerboda, the bringer of anguish, he fathered a trio of monstrous children, beings who were destined to become the gods' most terrifying adversaries in the final days of Ragnarok. The first was the great wolf, Fenrir, a creature of insatiable hunger and terrifying strength. The second was the world serpent, Jörmungandr, a snake of such immense size that he would eventually be cast into the Sea of Midgard, where he grew so large he could encircle the entire world and bite his own tail. The third was a daughter, Hel, a grim and terrifying being whose body was half that of a beautiful woman and half that of a rotting corpse. She would be cast down into the darkness of Niflheim to become the ruler of the dishonorable dead. These three children were the living embodiment of the darkness in Loki's heart. As time wore on, the balance within Loki's soul began to shift. The playful, mischievous trickster who got into scrapes and used his wits to fix them began to fade, and a darker, more bitter, and truly malevolent being began to emerge. His pranks became less about creating amusing chaos and more about causing genuine pain and humiliation. He began to resent the gods, their honor, their light, and their beauty. A poison was growing in his spirit, a slow-burning envy and hatred that would eventually curdle his cleverness into pure malice. This tragic downward spiral would culminate in one unforgivable act of cruelty, an act so vile that it would sever his ties to the gods forever and set in motion the final terrible prophecy of their doom. He was the flaw in the otherwise perfect crystal of Asgard, and it was his internal fracturing that would ultimately cause the whole structure to shatter. He was the shadow that walked among them, a constant reminder that the greatest threat often comes not from a declared enemy, but from a trusted friend. The slow creeping poison in Loki's spirit did not manifest overnight as an open act of rebellion. It began, as it always did, with a seemingly small incident, a casual journey that spiraled into a crisis threatening the very existence of the gods. To understand the gravity of this crisis, one must first understand a fundamental truth about the gods of Asgard. They were not truly immortal. Unlike the deathless deities of other pantheons, the Aesir and the Vanir were subject to the ravages of time. They could age, they could weaken, and as the prophecies foretold, they could most certainly die. Their long lives and youthful vigor were not an innate quality, but a state maintained by a single, precious, and vulnerable source: the golden apples of the goddess Idun. Idun was the gentle wife of Bragi, the god of poetry. She was the keeper of a sacred grove in Asgard, where she tended to a cluster of miraculous trees that bore fruit of pure, shimmering gold. These were not apples of mere sustenance, but of rejuvenation. Whenever the gods felt the first touch of age, a gray hair, a wrinkle on the skin, a stiffness in the joints, they would go to Idun, and she would give them one of her apples to eat. The fruit would instantly restore their youth, their strength, and their vitality. Idun and her apples were the secret to Asgard's eternal prime, the quiet, beating heart of its power, and Loki, in his thoughtless malice, was about to offer that heart up to the enemy. The tale begins with a journey. Odin, ever the wanderer, was traveling through the mountainous wilds of Midgard, and with him were two companions, the ever-present Loki and the god Ymir. After a long day of hiking, they grew hungry. They spotted a herd of wild oxen and managed to kill one for their supper. They built a fire in a pit and put the meat on to cook, but a strange thing happened. Hours passed, and the meat remained stubbornly raw. They piled on more wood, stoking the flames to a roaring heat, but the ox flesh simply would not cook. Perplexed and frustrated, they heard a voice call down from the branches of the great oak tree above them. There, perched on the highest bough, was a magnificent eagle, larger than any they had ever seen. "It is I who am preventing your meal from cooking," the eagle screeched. "But if you will give me my fair share of the ox, I will allow your fire to do its work." The gods, famished and in no mood to argue with a magical bird, readily agreed. The eagle then flew down, and with its sharp talons, it snatched up both hindquarters and both forequarters of the ox, the three best portions for itself. This was too much for Loki. His pride stung by being outsmarted and cheated by a bird. He impulsively grabbed a long, sturdy branch, and with all his might, he lunged and struck the eagle's back. In that moment, two things happened. The eagle's body proved to be as hard as iron, and the staff stuck fast to its back. At the same time, Loki's own hands became magically fused to the other end of the staff. The great eagle let out a cry of triumph and launched itself into the sky, with the helpless god of mischief dangling from the pole behind it. The eagle was, of course, no mere bird. It was the powerful storm giant, Thjazi, in one of his magical forms. He flew low and fast, dragging the terrified Loki through the tops of trees, over sharp rocks, and across thorny thickets. Loki's arms felt as if they were being torn from their sockets, and he screamed for the giant to release him. Thjazi, enjoying the god's torment, finally relented, but named a terrible price for his freedom. Loki was to swear a solemn oath that he would lure the goddess Idun and her rejuvenating apples out from the safety of Asgard and into Thjazi's clutches. Faced with an agonizing death, Loki agreed to the treacherous bargain. Upon his return to Asgard, bruised and battered but alive, Loki set about fulfilling his oath. He went to Idun's quiet grove and found the gentle goddess tending to her precious trees. With a charming smile and a conspiratorial whisper, he told her he had discovered a marvelous secret. In a small wood, just a short walk from Asgard's walls, he claimed to have found a wild apple tree that bore fruit even more spectacular than her own. He suggested, as a matter of professional interest, that she should come see for herself, and that she should bring her own apples with her, just to make a proper comparison. Idun, innocent and unaccustomed to such brazen deceit, was intrigued. She gathered her basket of golden apples and followed the trickster out of the gates, away from the protection of the divine fortress. They had not gone far into the woods when a shadow fell over them. A great wind roared down from the sky, and before Loki could even feign surprise, the giant Thjazi, once again in his eagle form, descended upon them. He seized the screaming goddess in his massive talons, and with his prize secure, flew away toward his mountain fortress in Jotunheim, Thrymheimr, the Thunder Home. In Asgard, the effect was almost immediate. Without their daily access to the fruit of youth, the gods began to wither. It was like watching a time-lapse film of a flower decaying. Their bright eyes grew dim, their smooth skin wrinkled and sagged, and their hair faded to a brittle, dusty gray. Thor's mighty arms grew thin, Odin's shoulders stooped, and Frigg's serene face became etched with the lines of age. The Golden Realm became a gloomy sanatorium for the old and feeble. Panic and fear gripped the divine halls. The gods held an emergency council, their voices creaky and their minds slow. They asked each other when Idun was last seen, and it was soon remembered that she had walked out of the gates in the company of Loki. They seized the trickster, their aged hands surprisingly strong with rage, and threatened him with every torment imaginable. Terrified, Loki confessed the entire sordid tale. There was no choice. The doom of the gods was at hand, and the only one who could fix the catastrophe was the one who had caused it. Faced with the wrath of the withering gods, Loki, for perhaps the first time, felt the icy grip of true fear. His own life was forfeit, unless he could undo the colossal damage he had done. All his cleverness, all his cunning, now had to be bent not toward selfish mischief, but toward a desperate act of restitution. He swore to the assembled gods that he would fly to Jotunheim and bring Idun back, along with her life-giving apples. But he could not go as himself. A direct assault on the fortress of the mighty giant Thjazi was suicide. He needed stealth, and he needed speed. For that, he went to the goddess Freya, the mistress of magic, and begged her to lend him her most prized possession, her falcon cloak. This was a magical garment of falcon feathers that would grant the wearer the form and flight of the swift bird. Freya, seeing the desperation of their plight and knowing it was their only hope, agreed. Loki wrapped the feathered cloak around his shoulders, and in a shimmer of magic, he was transformed. Where the trickster god had stood, there was now a sleek, powerful falcon, its eyes sharp and its talons ready. With a great beat of his new wings, he launched himself into the sky and flew north, his course set for the grim, mountainous realm of the giants. The journey was long and perilous. He flew over frozen wastes and jagged peaks where the wind cut like a knife. He soared higher than any mortal bird, a tiny speck of life against an unforgiving landscape. Finally, he saw it in the distance. Thrymheimr, the Thunder Home, Thiazi's fortress, a grim structure of ice and black stone clinging to the side of a mountain. With his falcon's keen sight, he circled the fortress, searching for any sign of the giant. Luck, for once, was with him. The fortress was quiet. Thiazi had gone out to the icy sea to fish, leaving his captive alone. Loki swooped down, landing silently on a windowsill, and peered inside. There was Idun, alone and weeping, a basket of golden apples beside her. He slipped into the room, and without a word of explanation, used his own magic to transform the terrified goddess. She shrank and hardened, her form condensing, until she was nothing more than a simple, brown nut, small enough for him to carry. Gently, he took the nut in his talons, snatched the basket of apples as well, and launched himself back into the air, his heart pounding with the thrill of the heist and the terror of the flight to come. He had not been gone long when Thiazi returned. The giant saw at once that his prisoner was missing and knew instantly who was to blame. Roaring with fury, he donned his own eagle feathers, a form far larger and more powerful than Loki's, and burst from his fortress in pursuit. The chase was on. Two specks in the vast, cold sky, one fleeing for the salvation of the gods, the other pursuing with all the righteous fury of a wronged titan. The great eagle was faster, his immense wings eating up the distance between them. Loki, as the falcon, was more agile, but he could feel the giant gaining on him, the shadow of the eagle's wings threatening to engulf him. Back in Asgard, the aged gods stood upon the high walls of their fortress, their dim eyes scanning the northern sky. It was Heimdall, the ever-watchful sentry, who saw them first. He pointed with a trembling hand at the two approaching birds. The gods recognized Freya's falcon and knew it must be Loki, and they saw the immense dark shape of the eagle closing in behind him. They understood the entire situation in an instant and knew they had only moments to act. With a surge of desperate energy, they began to gather great piles of wood shavings, stacking them high all along the length of the ramparts. Loki saw the walls of Asgard, a golden line on the horizon, and he pushed his falcon body to its absolute limit. The eagle was almost upon him, its talons outstretched. With one final, desperate burst of speed, Loki shot forward like an arrow. He flew low, just clearing the top of the wall, and collapsed in a heap of feathers on the other side, safe within the divine citadel. Thiazi, however, was locked into his pursuit. Traveling at an impossible speed, the giant eagle was unable to stop or alter its course. He soared over the wall, just a moment after Loki, directly into the trap, The instant he cleared the rampart, the gods lit the piles of wood shavings. The dry tinder erupted in a sheet of flame, a curtain of fire that shot hundreds of feet into the air. The eagle flew straight into it. His feathers were incinerated in a flash, his flight gone. A great, burning, and now helpless shape, the giant Thiazi plummeted from the sky and crashed to the ground inside the walls of Asgard. Before he could recover or reassume his giant form, the gods, now filled with a strength born of pure rage, fell upon him and killed him. The threat was over. Loki, exhausted, transformed Idun from a nut back into a goddess. She opened her basket, and the gods, one by one, ate the golden apples. Their youth and vitality returned in a glorious wave, the grey receding from their hair, the strength flowing back into their limbs. Asgard was saved. But the story does not end with the giant's death. This act of defense would have unforeseen consequences, for Thiazi had a daughter, the fierce and formidable giantess Skadi. When she learned of her father's slaying, she donned a full suit of armor and traveled to Asgard, not to wage war, but to demand Wergild, the lawful compensation for a slain kinsman. This is a fascinating turn, revealing that the relationship between gods and giants was not one of simple, endless warfare. It was also governed by codes of honor and law. The gods, acknowledging the justice of her claim, offered her a truce, the story of her reconciliation, choosing a husband from among the gods by looking only at their feet, and the challenge they faced in making the grim goddess laugh, is a tale for another time. But her arrival shows a profound truth of this mythological world. Every act, even a justified one, creates a new thread in the great tapestry of fate, weaving enemies and allies together in the most unexpected of ways. The resolution with the giantess Skadi, born from the death of her father Thiazi, brought a strange and unexpected peace to Asgard. But in a world governed by the whims of Loki, peace was always a temporary condition. The trickster god could not long abide a state of tranquility. His very nature required friction, chaos, and mischief to feel alive, and it was not long before another of his cruel, thoughtless pranks set in motion a series of events that would, paradoxically, end with the gods becoming more powerful than ever before. This story, like so many others, begins with Loki's casual malice and ends with his desperate life-or-death scheming. It began with an act of pure, pointless spite. He crept into the halls of Thor, into the bedchamber where the thunder god's wife, the beautiful Sif, lay sleeping. She was known throughout the 9 worlds for her magnificent hair, a shining cascade of pure gold that flowed down to her feet. It was her pride and Thor's delight, and Loki, for no reason other than the perverse pleasure of it, took out a knife and sheared it all off, leaving the goddess bald and weeping in humiliation. When Thor discovered what had been done, his rage was unlike any Asgard had ever seen. The entire fortress shook with his fury. He found Loki, and his massive hands closed around the trickster's throat, and he began to slowly and deliberately break every bone in his body. Screaming for his life, Loki swore a desperate oath. If Thor would only spare him, he would travel to Svartalfheim, the underground realm of the dwarves, and he would persuade those master craftsmen to forge a new head of hair for Sif, made of the finest gold, that would grow and behave exactly as real hair would. His life hanging in the balance, Thor agreed, and Loki, battered and terrified, scurried away to the deep, dark places of the world to make good on his promise. He went to two of the most renowned dwarven smiths, the sons of Ivaldi. He commissioned them not only to create the golden hair for Sif, but also to sweeten the deal for the other gods, to make two other masterpieces. The dwarves agreed, and from their magical forges they produced three treasures: the flowing golden hair for Sif, a magnificent spear for Odin named Gungnir, which was so perfectly balanced it would never miss its mark, and for the Vanir god Freyr, a wondrous ship called Skidbladnir, which was large enough to hold all the gods but could be magically folded up to fit inside a pocket. With these three treasures in hand, Loki's terror quickly morphed into his usual insufferable arrogance. He lingered in the dwarven caves and soon encountered two other master craftsmen, the brothers Brokkr and Atri. Loki began to boast, claiming that no smiths in the cosmos, and certainly not the two of them, could ever hope to craft treasures as fine as the ones he now held. His boasting grew so loud and so offensive that he made a foolish wager. He declared that Brokkr and Atri could not possibly make three treasures of equal or greater value, and he wagered his own head on the outcome. Brokkr, his professional pride stung, accepted the challenge. The two brothers went to their forge. Atri placed a pig's skin in the fire and instructed Brokkr to work the bellows without stopping, no matter what. As Atri left to prepare the magic, Loki transformed himself into a horsefly and bit Brokkr hard on the hand. Brokkr did not flinch, and he kept pumping. Atri returned and pulled from the forge their first creation, a magnificent boar with bristles of pure gold, which they named Gullinbursti. Next, Atri placed gold in the forge and gave the same instruction. Again, Loki the fly attacked, this time biting Brokkr on his thick neck. Brokkr's whole body shook, but he did not stop pumping the bellows. Atri returned and drew out a golden arm ring, which they called Draupnir, the Dripper. For every 9th night, 8 identical rings would drip from it. Finally, Atri placed iron in the forge for their final greatest work. "This will be the masterpiece," he warned. "If you stop now, all will be ruined." Loki, now desperate, returned for a third attack. He bit Brokkr directly on the eyelid, and the bite was so deep that blood streamed into his eye, blinding him. For just a single, crucial moment, Brokkr let go of the bellows with one hand to wipe the blood away. It was all the time Loki needed. When Atri returned, he pulled from the flames a mighty iron hammer. It was a weapon of immense power, but because of that single moment of interruption, its handle was forged too short. They named it Mjolnir. The dwarves and Loki then traveled to Asgard to have their creations judged. The gods, Odin, Thor, and Freya, sat as the arbiters. Loki presented his gifts first: the spear Gungnir to Odin, the ship Skidbladnir to Freya, and the golden hair to Sif, which attached itself to her head and began to grow. Then Brokkr came forward. He gave the ring Draupnir to Odin, the boar Gullinbursti to Freya, and finally the short-handled hammer Mjolnir to Thor. Brokkr explained that the hammer was the greatest weapon ever made, for it would be the gods' ultimate defense against the frost giants. After careful deliberation, the gods declared Brokkr the winner. Mjolnir, they decreed, was the most valuable treasure of all, for the safety it would provide far outweighed all the others. Brokkr then turned to Loki to claim his prize, the trickster's head, but Loki was already one step ahead. "You may have my head," he said with a sly grin, "but you have no claim on my neck. I wagered one, but not the other." All the gods agreed that this was a clever loophole, and that Brokkr could not cut off Loki's head without harming his neck. Enraged and cheated of his prize, Brokkr decided to at least punish the source of the trouble. He took a leather strap and a tool called an awl, and with Thor holding the squirming Loki down, he pierced the trickster's lips and stitched them tightly shut, finally bringing silence to the boastful mouth that had caused such chaos. And so the gods received their most iconic treasures, their defining attributes of power, not through noble quests, but as the accidental fallout from a mean-spirited prank and a boastful, foolish wager, a perfect testament to Loki's role as the unintentional, chaotic benefactor of Asgard. The acquisition of their great treasures cemented the iconic images of the male gods: Odin with his spear, Thor with his hammer, and Freya with his golden boar. But to focus only on them would be to ignore one of the most powerful, complex, and revered figures in all of Asgard, a goddess who commanded not one domain, but a multitude of them, blending love and war, magic and death into a single, formidable being. This was Freya, the lady, sister of Freya, and daughter of Njörður, one of the original Vanir hostages who had come to Asgard, and through her sheer force of character had become one of its central pillars. Freya was, first and foremost, the goddess of love and beauty. She was impossibly beautiful, a being of such radiant desirability that she was coveted by nearly every god, giant and dwarf in the cosmos. Her presence could inspire overwhelming passion and desire, and she was the one to whom prayers were offered for luck in love. But her domain was not limited to simple romance. She represented love in all its forms, from the purest affection to the most carnal, untamed lust. This association with desire was a source of both her power and her peril, as countless myths are driven by the desperate, often foolish, attempts of giants to win her hand in marriage, believing that possessing her would mean possessing all the beauty and abundance in the world. She was also a goddess of wealth, a trait she shared with her Vanir kin. It was said that when she wept, her tears fell to the earth as drops of pure red gold. This wasn't just a poetic image, it was a fundamental part of her being. She was a source of prosperity and riches, the embodiment of the earth's bounty. This aspect of her character was best represented by her most famous possession, a magnificent necklace of gold and amber known as Brisingamen. The story of its acquisition was a scandalous one, whispered in the halls of Asgard. She came upon 4 master dwarf smiths who were just completing the most beautiful necklace ever forged. Desperate to possess it, she offered them gold and silver, but they refused. They would part with it for only one price, that she spend one night with each of them. Freya, recognizing the necklace's worth and unafraid of her own desire, agreed to the bargain. This tale, often used by Loki to taunt her, perfectly illustrates her character. She is a being of immense passion, who understands the power of desire and is willing to use it to achieve her goals. It is this complexity that leads to the great scholarly mystery surrounding Freya, her relationship with Frigg, the wife of Odin. On the surface, the two goddesses seem to occupy very similar roles. Both are associated with love, fertility, and a form of prophecy. This has led many historians to hypothesize that Frigg and Freya may not have always been two separate deities. It's possible that in an earlier Proto-Germanic pantheon, there was a single great mother goddess who embodied all of these traits. As the myths evolved, And as different Germanic tribes with their own traditions came into contact, a process mythologized in the Aesir-Vanir War, this single figure may have been split into two. Frigg became the stately, queenly wife of the Aesir king, representing motherhood and domestic stability, while Freya became the wilder, more passionate, and magically inclined goddess of the Vanir, representing desire, wealth, and war. They may be two sides of the same ancient coin, their overlapping domains a clue to a lost, unified past. Perhaps Freya's most startling and powerful role was that of a war goddess, a chooser of the dead. In this, she was the equal of Odin himself. It was decreed that of all the warriors who fell bravely in battle, half would be chosen by Odin's Valkyries to feast in Valhalla, while the other half were chosen by Freya herself to live in her own great hall, Sessrumnir, located in a heavenly field, Folkvanger, the field of the people. The fact that she, a goddess of love and beauty, had the first pick of the slain heroes, even before the All-Father, speaks volumes about her immense power and status. She was not a passive recipient of affection. She was an active and formidable force in the cosmic struggle. This martial aspect was complemented by her being the ultimate master of Seder, the powerful Vanir magic concerned with discerning and shaping fate. It was a potent and at times feared form of sorcery, and Freya was its greatest living practitioner. It was she who first introduced this art to the Aesir, and it was Freya who personally taught its secrets to her greatest student, Odin. The All-Father's own considerable magical abilities were therefore a gift from this Vanir goddess, a testament to her profound influence on the entire pantheon. Her power was further amplified by her own magical treasures. She possessed the famous falcon cloak, which allowed her to fly between the worlds in the form of a bird, and she traveled not on horseback, but in a magnificent chariot pulled by two great cats, creatures that, like her, were both beautiful and fiercely independent. In all of existence, Freya stood as a testament to the power of the feminine, a being who refused to be defined by a single role. She was the lover who wept golden tears for her lost husband, Odin, and the warrior queen who gathered fallen heroes. She was the mistress of intoxicating desire and the master of fate-altering magic, a true and formidable queen in the court of the northern gods. The pantheon of Asgard, now fully formed by the union of Aesir and Vanir, was a complex tapestry of divine power. There was the subtle, magical, and often deceptive power of figures like Odin and Freya. And then there was the direct, indomitable, and reassuring power of Thor. The thunder god was the bedrock of their security, a being whose solution to any problem was a swift and decisive blow from his hammer, Mjolnir. He was the embodiment of the idea that strength could overcome any obstacle. But the Nine Worlds are a place of many kinds of power, and one of Thor's most famous journeys would teach him a humbling and profound lesson, that there are some forces in the cosmos that simply cannot be smashed. The adventure began, as they often did, with Thor on the move, his great chariot rumbling across the lands. He was accompanied by the ever-present Loki, and on this occasion, they stopped for the night at the humble cottage of a peasant farmer. Having a god's appetite, Thor needed to provide a meal, so he slaughtered his own two goats, Tangrisnir and Tangenjoster. He had them cooked and generously shared the meat with the peasant family, but with one strict instruction: they must not, under any circumstances, break any of the bones, but instead throw them all, whole and intact, onto the goatskins he had laid out by the fire. The family's young son, Thialfi, overcome by hunger and curiosity, ignored the warning. He used his knife to split one of the goat's thigh bones to suck out the rich, sweet marrow. The next morning, Thor rose, and holding his hammer, Mjolnir, over the goatskins, he blessed them and brought his two goats back to life, ready for the day's journey. But he immediately noticed that one of the animals was limping badly. Realizing his command had been disobeyed, the god's good humor vanished in a clap of thunder. His eyes blazed, and his knuckles turned white as he gripped his hammer, ready to destroy the entire family for their insolence. The terrified peasants fell to their knees, begging for their lives. Seeing their genuine terror, Thor's rage subsided, but a price had to be paid. As compensation for the injury to his goat, the boy Thialfi and his sister Röskva were to become Thor's bondservants from that day forward. And so, with his two new human companions and Loki in tow, Thor set off eastward toward the misty, treacherous realm of Jotunheim. After traveling through a vast and menacing forest, the four companions sought shelter for the night in a strange, cavernous building they found in a clearing. It was an odd hall with a single, immense room and a smaller alcove off to one side. They settled in for the night, but their sleep was shattered by a series of terrifying earthquakes and a deafening roaring sound that echoed through the forest. Fearing the roof would collapse, they huddled in the side chamber until morning. When they emerged, they found the source of the noise. A giant of truly colossal proportions lay sleeping nearby, and it was his snores that had shaken the very foundations of the earth. As they looked closer, they realized the building they had slept in was no building at all. It was the giant's discarded glove, and the side chamber had been its thumb. The giant awoke, stretched, and introduced himself as Ymir, or Big Guy. He was surprisingly amiable, and upon learning they were traveling in the same direction, offered to journey with them. He gathered up all of their provisions into his own enormous sack and slung it over his shoulder, and they set off. That evening, Skrymir found a spot for them to rest and promptly fell asleep, telling them to help themselves to the food in the sack. But when the hungry travelers tried to open the bag, they found it was tied with a series of knots, so complex and magically reinforced that not even Thor could undo them. Enraged and hungry, Thor took up Mjolnir and struck the sleeping giant on the forehead with all his might. Skrymir stirred. "Did a leaf just fall on my head?" he mumbled, and went back to sleep. Annoyed, Thor waited a while and then struck again, a blow so hard he was sure he had crushed the giant's skull. Skrymir woke again. "Ah, an acorn, I think," he said drowsily. "It must have fallen on me." Utterly furious, Thor delivered a third and final blow, a truly cataclysmic strike meant to end the giant once and for all. Skrymir sat up, rubbing his cheek. "There must be birds nesting in the tree above," he said. "I think one of them dropped a twig on me." He then announced he was parting ways with them, pointed them toward the nearby castle of the giant king Loki, and ambled off, leaving the god of thunder utterly bewildered and humiliated. Finally arriving at the king's fortress, a castle so tall its towers seemed to scrape the clouds, Thor and his companions entered the great hall. The king, Loki, mocked their small size and challenged them to prove their worth in a series of contests. First, Loki, who boasted of being the fastest eater in the world, was pitted against a thin courtier named Loki, in an eating contest. Loki ate all the meat in his half of the trough, but Loki ate the meat, the bones, and the trough itself. Loki had lost. Next, the swift-footed Thjalfi was challenged to a foot race against a young boy named Hugi. Thjalfi ran faster than he ever had in his life, but Hugi outpaced him effortlessly 3 times in a row. Thjalfi had lost. Then it was Thor's turn. The giants challenged him to a drinking contest, presenting him with a large horn. Thor took 3 monumental gulps, each one long enough to drain a barrel, but the level in the horn barely seemed to fall. Humiliated, he was then challenged to lift the king's grey cat from the floor. Thor summoned all his divine strength, but could only manage to raise one of its paws. As a final insulting test, he was told to wrestle an old woman, the king's ancient nurse, Ellie. Thor struggled with all his might, but the frail-looking crone was impossibly strong, and the match ended with the mighty god of thunder being forced down onto one knee. The next morning, a dejected Thor and his companions were escorted out of the castle by Loki. Once they were clear of the gates, the giant king revealed the truth. It had all been an illusion, a masterwork of giant magic. Skrymir had been him in disguise, and the bag of provisions had been sealed with magic. Thor's 3 hammer blows had missed the giant's head and had instead struck a nearby mountain, carving 3 new, massive valleys into its face. In the contests, Loki had not competed against a man, but against Loki, wildfire itself. Thjalfi had not raced a boy, but Hugi thought, which is faster than any runner. The drinking horn Thor had tried to empty was magically connected to the ocean, and his 3 great gulps had been so immense they had created the tides. The cat he had struggled to lift was in fact the Midgard serpent which encircles the world, and the fact that he had managed to lift it even a little had terrified all who watched. And the old woman, Ellie, was not a woman at all. She was old age, which no being, god or mortal, can ever hope to defeat. As Thor, stunned and furious at the deception, turned to strike the giant with his hammer, Loki and his entire castle vanished into thin air, leaving the god of thunder alone on the plain, forever humbled by the knowledge that the greatest forces in the universe are the ones that cannot be met with strength alone. Thor's humbling journey to the castle of Loki served as a stark reminder that brute force, no matter how immense, was not the answer to every problem the cosmos presented. It was a lesson his father, Odin, had long ago taken to heart. The All-Father's power was rooted not in the strength of his arm, but in the cunning of his mind and the utter ruthlessness of his will. Where Thor met challenges head-on with a swing of his hammer, Odin preferred a more subtle, indirect approach, a path of disguise, deception, and, when necessary, cold-blooded pragmatism. His quest to secure the legendary mead of poetry is the ultimate testament to his methods, a story that begins with a peace treaty and ends in a grand cosmic theft. The tale's origins lie in the formal end of the great Aesir-Vanir war. To seal their newfound peace, all the gods of both tribes gathered, and as a symbolic act of their union, they all spat into a single great vat. From this divine saliva, they shaped a being of unparalleled wisdom. His name was Kvasir. He was not truly a god, but the living embodiment of the combined knowledge of the entire pantheon. He was so wise that there was no question in any of the 9 worlds that he could not answer. Kvasir spent his days traveling the lands, a benevolent teacher sharing his infinite wisdom freely with any who would listen. But such brilliance often inspires jealousy in lesser hearts. Two malicious dwarf brothers, Fiala and Galar, saw Kvasir's wisdom not as a gift to the world, but as a prize to be possessed. They invited the wise being into their underground home and, without warning, murdered him. They then drained every drop of his blood into 3 large containers, 2 vats named Son and Bodden, and a kettle called Odhrir, the stirrer of inspiration. The dwarves then mixed Kvasir's blood with honey. The concoction fermented, transforming into a magical, intoxicating mead. This was the mead of poetry. Anyone who took even a single sip would be gifted with the sublime skill of the poet and the profound insight of the scholar. Inspiration was no longer an abstract concept. It was a liquid that could be bottled. The dwarves did not keep their prize for long. Their cruel nature led them to commit another murder, this time killing a giant named Gilling. Gilling's son, the powerful giant Suttung, soon came seeking vengeance. He captured the 2 dwarves and was about to drown them in the sea when they, in desperation, offered him their greatest treasure as compensation for his father's death: the 3 vessels containing the mead of poetry. Suttung accepted the bargain. He took the mead and hid it deep within a chamber inside the mountain Nidbjörg, and he set his own daughter, the giantess Gunnlod, to be its guardian, to watch over it day and night. Word of this magical elixir eventually reached Odin in Asgard, and it ignited his obsessive thirst for knowledge. He knew he had to possess it. He set out from Asgard alone, once again disguised as a wanderer, this time taking the name Bölvaker, which means the evil worker. He came to a field belonging to Suttung's brother, Baugi, where 9 slaves were struggling to mow hay with dull scythes. Odin, in his guise as a simple farmhand, offered to sharpen their blades with a magic whetstone he carried. The blades became so sharp that the work was effortless. Overcome with greed, the slaves all begged to buy the whetstone. Odin coolly tossed the stone high into the air, and as the 9 slaves looked up and scrambled to catch it, they ended up slicing each other's throats with their newly sharpened scythes. With this single, pitiless act, Odin had eliminated 9 workers, creating a convenient job opening for himself. He then went to Baugi and, as Bölvaker, offered to do the work of all 9 men for the entire summer. The price he asked was not gold or land, but a single sip of his brother Suttung's famous mead. Baugi agreed. After a long summer of hard labor, Odin demanded his payment. Baugi went to his brother, but Suttung furiously refused to part with even a single drop. Odin then revealed his true nature to Baugi and forced the giant to help him. He gave Baugi a magical auger called Ratti, the Gnawer, and commanded him to drill a hole through the side of the mountain into the chamber where the mead was kept. Once the hole was complete, Odin transformed himself into a snake and slithered inside. Inside the hidden chamber, he found the giantess Gunnlod, dutifully watching over the 3 great vessels. Resuming his handsome divine form, Odin worked his charms on the lonely guardian of the mead. For 3 nights, he stayed with her, offering her his affection and company. In return for those 3 nights, the smitten Gunnlod agreed to grant him 3 sips of the mead. Odin, however, had no intention of being so modest. With his first sip, he completely drained the kettle Odhrir. With his second, he emptied the vat Bodden. And with his third and final sip, he drank every last drop from the vat Son. He now held the entirety of the mead of poetry within his own body. Wasting no time, he transformed into a great eagle and burst from the mountain, flying with all his speed toward the distant safety of Asgard. Suttung, seeing the eagle escape, knew instantly what had happened. He took on his own eagle form and gave chase in a furious pursuit across the sky. As the two eagles neared Asgard, the gods saw their king approaching with his enemy close behind. They quickly placed several large jars out in the open. Odin swooped over the walls and neatly regurgitated the precious mead into the waiting containers. But in his haste, with Suttung's beak just inches away, a few drops of the precious liquid spattered from his rear. This small tainted portion fell down to Midgard, becoming the source of inspiration for all the world's bad poets and hacks. The pure mead, however, was now safe in Asgard, its power belonging to Odin. From that day on, he would dispense it carefully, granting the gift of true poetry only to the gods and to those few mortals he deemed worthy of the divine fire of inspiration. Odin's relentless quests for knowledge were not born of simple curiosity. They were driven by a desperate need to prepare for a prophesied doom. His drink from Mimir's well and his theft of the mead of poetry had granted him a terrible foresight, allowing him to see the agents of his own destruction. He knew that the greatest threats to the divine order would come not from a foreign enemy, but from the children of his own blood brother, Loki, from the trickster's secret union with the giantess Angerboda, the bringer of anguish. 3 monstrous children had been born in the iron forests of Jotunheim, and prophecy was clear that they would be the undoing of the gods. There was the great serpent, Jörmungandr, the half-dead queen of the underworld, Hel, and the most fearsome of them all, the great wolf, Fenrir. Knowing this, the gods of Asgard made a preemptive strike. They traveled to Jotunheim and seized Loki's 3 children while they were still young, bringing them back to Asgard to face judgment. Their actions were swift and pragmatic. Odin had the serpent Jörmungandr thrown into the vast ocean that encircles Midgard. There, the serpent grew and grew until he was so immense he could surround the entire world and bite his own tail, earning him the name the Midgard Serpent. The grim daughter, Hel, whose body was half living woman and half blue-black corpse, Odin cast down into the darkest depths of Niflheim. He gave her dominion over that realm and authority over all who died of sickness or old age, making her the queen of the dishonorable dead. But the wolf, Fenrir, was a different matter. Perhaps they thought they could control him, or perhaps they simply delayed the inevitable. But the gods decided to raise the wolf pup themselves within the walls of Asgard. As he grew, however, he grew at a terrifying rate, his strength and ferocity becoming more apparent each day. Soon he was so large and so menacing that only one god was brave enough to approach him and bring him his daily meal of raw meat. Tyr, the god of law, justice, and heroic glory. The prophecies continued to haunt the gods. They saw the wolf's power increasing, and they knew they could not allow him to roam free. Yet to kill him within the sacred grounds of Asgard would be a sacrilege, a stain upon their home so profound that it would have its own dire consequences. Their only option was to bind him, to neutralize the threat without committing the crime of murder. And so they decided to trick him. They approached Fenrir with a great iron chain they had forged, which they called lading. "Let us test your strength, mighty wolf," they said. Let us see if you can break this fetter." Fenrir, proud and confident, and not yet suspecting their treachery, allowed them to bind him. With a single mighty flex of his shoulders, the chain shattered into 100 pieces. The gods feigned admiration for his strength, but in truth, they were terrified. They went back to their forges and created a second chain, twice as strong as the first, which they named Dromi. Again, they brought it to Fenrir, praising his might and challenging him to break this even greater bond to increase his renown. The wolf considered for a moment. He knew this would be more difficult, but he also knew his strength had grown, and the fame he would gain was a powerful lure. He allowed himself to be bound a second time. He stretched and strained, heaving against the massive iron links, and with a tremendous struggle that shook the ground, Dromi too shattered. Now the gods were in a state of true panic. They knew no physical chain they could forge would ever be strong enough to hold him. So Odin dispatched a messenger down to the dark, subterranean realm of Svartalfheim, to the master craftsmen, the dwarves. He commanded them to create a bond that could not be broken. The dwarves, using their secret and powerful magic, forged a fetter unlike any other. They made it from 6 impossible, conceptual ingredients: the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. The resulting chain, which they named Gleipnir, was as thin and as soft as a silk ribbon. The gods brought this silken ribbon to Fenrir, telling him it was a magical trifle from the dwarves, and that, if he could break such a slender thread after having shattered 2 great iron chains, his fame would be unparalleled. But the wolf was no fool. He looked at the soft, slight ribbon and sensed the powerful magic coiled within it. "There is no glory for me in breaking such a flimsy band," he said, his great eyes glinting with suspicion. "And if it is made with trickery and magic, then I will get no help from you once it is on me. I will not allow you to place it on me unless one of you is willing to place his hand in my mouth as a pledge of good faith." A heavy silence fell upon the gods. They looked at one another, their faces grim, for they all knew that their intention was to betray the wolf. None was willing to make the sacrifice. And then Tyr, the god of justice, the god whose very being was a testament to the sanctity of an oath, stepped forward. For the good of all, he knew he must be the one to participate in this act of ultimate dishonor. Without a word, he placed his right hand between the wolf's powerful waiting jaws. The other gods then quickly bound Fenrir with the silken ribbon. The wolf began to struggle, to push and pull with all his might, but the more he fought against Gleipnir, the tighter and harder the magical ribbon became. He was caught. When he realized the gods were not going to release him, he snapped his mighty jaws, severing Tyr's hand at the wrist. The gods all let out a great laugh to see the fearsome wolf finally bound, all except for Tyr. He had lost his hand, but in that moment, he had lost far more. He had lost his honor. This story of betrayal lies at the heart of the gods' tragedy. In their attempt to forestall their doom, they commit a foundational sin. By tricking Fenrir and breaking their sworn pledge, they give the wolf a just cause for his vengeance. They themselves validate the prophecy. They drag the bound and howling wolf to a remote island, anchored the fetter to a great stone slab, and to silence his roars, they wedged a sword upright in his mouth, with the hilt on his lower jaw and the point against his upper jaw. There he remains, bound and betrayed, dreaming of his revenge at the end of the world. And Tyr remains the one-handed god, a constant living reminder that the price of security is sometimes honor itself, and that a doom avoided through treachery is not avoided at all, but merely guaranteed. The binding of the great wolf Fenrir was a dark and necessary act, a stain on the honor of the gods that they accepted as the price of their continued existence. The act itself was a tacit admission of their greatest fear, that their golden age was finite, and that forces were gathering that would one day seek to destroy them. While they had neutralized one of the greatest prophesied threats, this only heightened their awareness of the need for constant vigilance. The personification of that vigilance, the ever-watchful, ever-ready guardian of the divine realm, was the enigmatic god Heimdall. Heimdall was a being uniquely suited to his solemn task. He was the celestial sentry, the watchman who stood guard at the borders of Asgard, his senses tuned to the subtlest shifts in the cosmic balance. His hearing was so miraculously acute that he could perceive the sound of wool growing on a sheep's back from leagues away, and he could hear the grass pushing its way up through the soil of Midgard. His eyesight was equally phenomenal, allowing him to see with perfect clarity for hundreds of miles, whether in the brightest day or the darkest night, and he required less sleep than a bird, enabling him to maintain his post with an almost unbroken watchfulness. His entire being was an instrument of perception, dedicated to a single, profound purpose: to see and hear the approach of doom before it arrived. His own origin is one of the deepest mysteries in the entire pantheon, a poetic riddle that speaks to his fundamental nature. He was known as the son of 9 mothers, 9 sisters, who were said to be the daughters of the sea god Aegir, the very personification of the waves. He was born on the shores where the land meets the sea, nourished by the strength of the earth and the cold of the ocean. This strange parentage is likely a powerful metaphor. As the guardian who lives on the threshold between worlds, the sacred realm of Asgard and the mortal bridge of Bifrost, it is poetically fitting that he would be born from the waves, the natural and ever-shifting boundary of the land. He is a liminal deity, a being of the borders, his very essence tied to the thresholds he is destined to protect. Heimdall's hall in Asgard was called Himinbjörg, the Heaven's Mountain, and it was strategically placed at the very top of the celestial plane, at the precise point where the shimmering, burning rainbow bridge, Bifrost, connected to the land of the gods. It was here that he stood his endless watch, drinking fine mead and looking out over the worlds. And with him, always, was his most important possession, the great horn known as Gjallarhorn. The name means the yelling horn, or the resounding horn, and its purpose was singular and terrifying. It was the great alarm of the gods. Heimdall was destined to raise this horn to his lips only once, at the very onset of Ragnarok. The blast he would sound would be so powerful, so pure and clear, that it would be heard in every corner of all the 9 worlds, alerting every god, giant, dwarf, and spirit that the final battle had begun. The horn, kept in readiness for that final fateful day, was the ultimate symbol of the gods' anxious anticipation of their end. Heimdall was also known as the White God, suggesting a shining, radiant appearance, which was complemented by his famous golden teeth. He had a horse with a golden mane named Gulltopper, and he carried a sword that was sometimes poetically referred to simply as head. But more than his possessions, he was defined by his relationship with his polar opposite, Loki. If Heimdall was the embodiment of order, loyalty, and unwavering vigilance, Loki was the personification of chaos, betrayal, and treacherous cunning. A deep and abiding animosity existed between the two, a mutual hatred that would find its final expression at the end of the world. One famous tale solidifies their rivalry, telling of a time when Loki stole Freya's precious necklace, Brisingamen. Heimdall, in his duty to protect Asgard's treasures, pursued him. The two fought a desperate battle for the necklace near the sea, both shape-shifting into seals, a strange and primal conflict that cemented them as eternal adversaries. In one fascinating and unique poem, the Rikstula, Heimdall takes on an entirely different role, that of a progenitor and organizer of human society. In this story, he travels through Midgard in the guise of a clever and powerful man named Rigger. He visits 3 different households: a poor and hard-working couple, a skilled and prosperous craftsman and his wife, and a wealthy and idle aristocrat and his lady. He stays with each for 3 nights, sleeping between the husband and wife, and 9 months later, each wife gives birth to a son. These 3 sons become the ancestors of the 3 great social classes of mankind. The boy named Thrall becomes the ancestor of the serfs and slaves. The boy Karl becomes the ancestor of the free farmers and craftsmen. And the boy Jarl becomes the ancestor of the warrior aristocracy. It is a strange and socially rigid tale, but it adds a fascinating layer to Heimdall's character, casting him not just as a guardian of the gods, but as a divine father of humanity's social order. And so, Heimdall waits. While other gods travel and scheme, fight and feast, the white god remains at his post, a solitary, silent figure against the shimmering colors of the rainbow bridge. He is the quiet tension at the heart of Asgard, the embodiment of their knowledge that peace is not a permanent state, but a temporary condition. A long, quiet watch before the inevitable sounding of the horn. The lone, vigilant figure of Heimdall stood at his post, a symbol of the god's anxious watchfulness, a constant guardian against a doom that was, for a long time, merely a prophecy, a whisper on the winds of fate. But the event that would transform that vague future dread into a present and unbearable grief. The event that would truly begin the twilight of the gods did not come from a frontal assault by the giants. It came, as the most devastating wounds often do, from within. It was an act of pure, calculated malice, orchestrated by Loki, and it was aimed at the one being in Asgard whose death would extinguish the very light of their world, Balder the Beautiful. Balder was the son of Odin and Frigg, and he was the god of light, purity, joy, and innocence. He was so fair of face and so gentle of spirit that a radiant light seemed to emanate from him. He was beloved by every god, every mortal, every animal, and every plant. His home, a hall named Breidablik, was a place where no lie could be spoken and no unclean thing could ever enter. He was the embodiment of the gods' golden age, the perfect and untroubled heart of Asgard. And then he began to have nightmares. He was plagued by dark, oppressive dreams, terrible premonitions of his own imminent death that left him shaken and filled the halls of the gods with an unprecedented anxiety. Frigg, his mother, was sent into a panic by these omens. In a desperate attempt to defy fate, she embarked on an extraordinary mission. She traveled through all the 9 worlds, from the fiery depths of Muspelheim to the misty shores of Jotunheim, and she extracted a solemn and binding oath from every single thing in existence. She took an oath from fire and water, from iron and every other kind of metal. She spoke with stones and earth, with trees and shrubs, with diseases and poisons. She extracted a promise from every beast that walks, every bird that flies, and every serpent that crawls upon the ground. She made them all swear that they would never, under any circumstances, harm her son Balder. With this universal oath secured, Balder appeared to be utterly invincible. A new and joyful game became the favorite pastime of the gods. They would lead Balder out onto the plain of Yggdrasil and test his invulnerability. Some would throw stones at him, others would hurl spears, and some would even strike at him with their swords and axes. But true to the oaths, nothing could harm him. The weapons and projectiles would either swerve at the last moment or bounce harmlessly off his body. It was a great spectacle, a celebration of their victory over fate, and all the gods laughed and delighted in it. All, that is, except one. Loki watched, and his heart filled not with joy, but with a bitter, burning envy. Disguising himself as a frail old woman, Loki went to Fenrir, the hall of Frigg. He praised her for her cleverness and asked if it was really true that every single thing had sworn the oath. Frigg, her heart swelling with a mother's pride, made a fatal mistake. She confided in the old woman that there was one thing she had not bothered to ask for an oath from, one thing she had deemed too young, too small, and too harmless to ever pose a threat. A humble shrub that grew west of Valhalla, the mistletoe. Hearing this, Loki immediately departed. He found the mistletoe, pulled a sturdy branch from it, and with his clever knife, he whittled it into a sharp, hardened dart. He then returned to the gods' assembly, where the game was still in full swing. He noticed one god standing at the edge of the circle, not participating in the joyous sport, Höder, Balder's twin brother, who had been blind from birth. Loki approached him and asked, in a voice full of false sympathy, why he did not join the others in honoring his brother. Höder replied sadly that he could not see where Balder was standing, and besides, he had no weapon. "Come now," Loki said, his voice a poisonous whisper of encouragement. "You should honor him like the others. I will guide your hand. Throw this little twig at him." He pressed the mistletoe dart into the blind god's hand. Höder, trusting and innocent, took the dart. Loki placed his own hand over his, aimed it carefully, and helped him throw it with all his might. The dart flew straight and true, striking Balder in the chest. It pierced him through, and without a sound, Balder the Beautiful fell to the ground, dead. A silence fell over the assembled gods, a silence so deep and so profound that it seemed to swallow all the light and joy in the universe. They were frozen, paralyzed by a grief and horror so immense it was beyond words. They all looked at Loki, and they all knew what he had done. But this was a place of peace, where no vengeance could be taken. The game was over. The light of Asgard had been extinguished by an act of pure malice, carried out by the hand of blind ignorance. In their grief, the gods refused to accept the finality of their loss. Frigg asked for a volunteer to undertake the perilous journey to the land of the dead, to plead with the goddess Hel for Balder's return. Hermod the Bold, another of Odin's sons, bravely accepted the task. For 9 days and 9 nights, he rode Odin's 8-legged steed, Sleipnir, through valleys so dark he could see nothing, until he finally reached the gates of Hel's realm. There, he found his brother Balder, seated in a place of honor. Hermodr begged the Queen of the Dead to release him, telling her of the boundless sorrow of the gods. Hel, in her grim wisdom, agreed to a bargain. Balder could return to the land of the living, but only if one condition was met. Every single thing in all the 9 worlds, living or dead, had to weep for him. Messengers were sent to every corner of creation, and they found a world united in grief. Men and women wept. The giants in their mountains wept. The dwarves in their caves wept. Even the trees and the stones shed tears for the fallen god of light. The messengers, their mission almost complete, found one last creature, an old giantess sitting in a dark cave. Her name was Thok, and she alone refused. Thok will weep dry tears for Balder's burial, she sneered. Let Hel hold what she has. It was, of course, Loki in his final, cruelest disguise. Because of that one refusal, the condition was not met. Balder's fate was sealed. The gods' last hope was gone. Their golden age was finished, and their grief now began to curdle into a grim and terrible resolve for vengeance. The death of Balder was a wound from which Asgard could never truly recover. The grief of the gods was a palpable thing, a heavy, silent fog that settled over the golden halls. Their first duty was to honor their fallen prince. They held the grandest funeral the 9 worlds had ever seen. Balder's body was carried to his great ship, Ringhorni, the largest of all vessels. The gods wished to launch it into the sea to serve as his funeral pyre, but it was so immense that none of them had the strength to move it. They sent for a giantess named Hyrrokin, who arrived riding on a great wolf with vipers for reins. With a single mighty push, she sent the great ship crashing into the water with such force that fire flashed from the rollers beneath it, and the whole earth trembled. Balder's body was laid upon the pyre built on the ship's deck. When his wife, the goddess Nanna, saw her husband's body, her own heart broke from pure sorrow, and she collapsed and died. The gods placed her on the pyre beside him. Thor consecrated the pyre with his hammer, Mjolnir, and Balder's horse, in full harness, was led onto the ship to be burned with its master. Beings from all across the worlds came to pay their respects. Odin and his ravens, Freya in her cat-drawn chariot, Freyr on his golden boar, and even frost giants and mountain giants stood on the shore, their ancient enmity with the gods momentarily forgotten in the face of such a universal sorrow. The great ship was set ablaze and pushed out to sea, a floating mountain of fire carrying the light of the world away into the final darkness. While the gods mourned, Loki, the architect of their pain, performed one last, breathtaking act of arrogance. The sea giant Aegir was holding a great feast for the gods in his hall, and Loki, now a pariah, brazenly crashed the party. What followed was a tirade of insults and accusations known as the Lokasenna, or Loki's quarrel. One by one, he went down the line of assembled gods and goddesses, his silver tongue dripping with venom, and he exposed their deepest shames and most secret hypocrisies. He mocked their courage, accused every goddess of infidelity, and gloated openly about his own role in Balder's death, the one crime that was truly unforgivable. His taunts continued until the one god he truly feared finally arrived, Thor. The thunder god his eyes blazing, threatened to silence Loki's malicious tongue permanently with his hammer. For the first time, Loki fell silent, and knowing he was no match for Thor's rage, he fled the hall. The final thread of tolerance had snapped. The age of Loki, the mischievous trickster, was over. This was Loki the murderer, the enemy of all that was good. The gods now hunted him with a grim and unified purpose. Loki fled to a remote mountain where he built a house with 4 doors, allowing him to see in every direction. He spent his days in fear, often transforming himself into a salmon and hiding in the waters of a nearby waterfall. One day, sitting by his fire, he began to weave a net of linen thread, contemplating the ways his enemies might try to catch him. Seeing the gods approaching in the distance, he threw the finished net into the fire to destroy the evidence of his thoughts and leaped into the river. But Kvasir, the wisest of the gods, saw the diamond-shaped pattern of the burnt twine in the ashes and understood its purpose. The gods quickly wove a net of their own and began to drag the river. Twice, Loki managed to evade them, but on the 3rd pass, knowing he would be caught, he made a desperate leap over the net. But Thor was waiting in midstream, and with a lunge, caught the slippery salmon in his bare hand. The grip was so immensely strong that it squeezed the fish's body near the tail, which, the stories say, is why all salmon are tapered at their rear. The gods dragged their captive to a dark and desolate cave deep beneath the earth. Their vengeance was to be as terrible as Loki's crime had been. They also brought Loki's 2 sons by his wife Sigyn, the brothers Vali and Narfi. In an act of horrifying cruelty, the gods used their magic to transform young Vali into a slavering wolf, who then, in a mindless rage, turned on his own brother and tore him to pieces. The gods then took the warm, steaming entrails of the murdered Narfi and used them as ropes, binding Loki's shoulders, waist, and knees to 3 massive, sharp-edged slabs of rock. As the entrails settled, they hardened into chains of unbreakable iron. But their revenge was not yet complete. Skadi, the giantess who had married into the Aesir after her father Thiazi's death, had her own score to settle with the one who had orchestrated that event. She found a monstrously large and venomous serpent and secured it to the roof of the cave, directly above Loki's bound head. There, the serpent was positioned so that its burning venom would drip, drop by agonizing drop, directly onto Loki's upturned face for all eternity. This brutal, almost ritualistic punishment was more than just torture. It was a cosmic act of suppression. By using the entrails of Loki's own son to bind him, the gods were using a part of his own chaotic nature to contain itself. His torment was to be perpetual, a symbol of the constant, painful effort required to keep the forces of destruction in check. Yet, in this place of ultimate suffering, one small flicker of compassion remained. Loki's loyal and blameless wife, Sigyn, never left his side. She sits with him in the darkness of the cave, holding a wooden bowl above his head to catch the serpent's venom. But every so often, the bowl becomes full, and she must turn away for a moment to empty it. In those brief seconds, the poison drips onto Loki's face. The pain is so excruciating that he writhes and thrashes against his iron bonds, and his violent convulsions shake the very foundations of the world. And that, the old stories tell us, is the cause of earthquakes. And so Loki is left, bound and broken, his heart filling with a poison to match the one on his skin, waiting, like the wolf Fenrir, for the day when his bonds will break and he can finally unleash his full and terrible vengeance upon the world. The binding of Loki in the dark cave beneath the earth marked a grim turning point for the gods. The greatest agent of internal chaos was now neutralized, but his capture was not a victory. It was an admission that the age of games and adventures was over, and the long, grim watch for the end of the world had begun. While the trickster lay stewing in his own venomous rage, his blood brother, Odin, turned his full attention to the single greatest project of his long existence, preparing for the inevitable, cataclysmic war of Ragnarok. Knowing he could not prevent the end, the All-Father was determined to face it with the greatest army the 9 worlds had ever known. And to build this army, he created a warrior's paradise, a hall of heroes known as Valhalla. Valhalla, the hall of the slain, was no peaceful, ethereal heaven. It was a divine military academy and barracks, a place forged for a single glorious purpose. It stood in the realm of Heimdall, the radiant home within Asgard, and its sheer scale was a testament to its grim function. The great hall's rafters were not wood, but polished spears. Its roof was not tile, but overlapping shields of gleaming gold. Inside, the long feasting benches were not covered in cloth, but draped with shining coats of chainmail. Most telling of all were its entrances. Valhalla had 540 massive doors, each one wide enough for 800 warriors to march through side by side at a full charge. The inhabitants of this magnificent hall were the Einhajar, a word that means the lone fighters, or those who fight in an army of one. These were not gods, but the spirits of the bravest and most skilled human warriors from Midgard. This afterlife was not a reward for a morally good life, but an exclusive honor reserved for those who had died a glorious death in the heat of battle. A peaceful death in one's bed was a path to the grim, shadowy halls of hell. Only a warrior's death offered a chance to feast with the gods. This belief shaped an entire culture, placing the highest value on courage in the face of death. The task of selecting these elite, mortal warriors fell to a group of formidable and mysterious beings known as the Valkyries. Their name means the choosers of the slain, and they were Odin's supernatural warrior maidens. In the sagas and poems, they are depicted as beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. They would ride down from Asgard on magnificent winged horses, soaring over the battlefields of Midgard like storm clouds. Clad in gleaming helmets and armor, carrying spears and shields, they would weave through the chaos of human conflict, observing the fighters. It was their solemn duty to decide the outcome of the battle and to choose which of the fallen heroes were worthy of an afterlife in Odin's hall. The image of these shining, armored women riding through the sky was so powerful that some Norse poets claimed the aurora borealis, the northern lights, was nothing more than the eerie light reflecting from the Valkyries' armor as they carried out their sacred duty. The very nature of the Valkyries is a compelling mystery. Were they a distinct race of divine beings, or perhaps the spirits of human shield maidens elevated to a higher purpose? Their dual role in the mythology offers a clue to their complexity. On the battlefield, they were grim-faced arbiters of life and death. But once they returned to Valhalla with their chosen heroes, they would put aside their armor and spears. In the Great Hall, they would become serene and graceful cup-bearers, their role shifting to serving the Einhajar with endless horns of the finest mead. This duality, from fierce warrior to gentle server, reflects a complex worldview, one that saw both ferocity and hospitality as essential virtues. Life for the Einhajar in Valhalla was an unending cycle of glorious combat and joyous feasting. Every single morning, at the crow of the rooster Gullinkambi, the warriors would rise, don their armor, and march out into the great courtyard. There, they would fight one another in a massive, joyous battle, indulging their warrior spirits to the fullest, wounding and even killing each other in spectacular duels. But every evening, as the sun set, a miracle would occur. All wounds would be healed, all severed limbs restored, and all the dead would rise again, whole and unharmed. They would then all return to the great hall together, friends and comrades once more, to feast. Their nightly banquet was a magical affair. They would feast upon the flesh of a great cosmic boar named Aesir-Vanir. He was large enough to feed the entire host, and though he was slaughtered and cooked every single night, he was magically restored to life the next morning, ready to be feasted upon again. To wash down the boar's meat, they would drink an endless supply of heavenly mead. This mead flowed not from barrels, but from the udders of a goat named Idun, who stood on the very roof of Valhalla, nibbling on the leaves of a great tree. And so, the cycle would continue, day after day, year after year. It was a warrior's dream, a life of endless battle without permanent death, and endless feasting without consequence. But beneath all the glory and the revelry lay Odin's cold, hard calculation. This was not a reward. This was a training exercise. Every battle, every feast, every resurrection was designed to hone these warriors into the most formidable fighting force the universe had ever known, preparing them for the one battle that truly mattered. They were Odin's great, desperate gamble, an army of the greatest mortal heroes, being forged to stand with the gods on the plains of Vigrid at the end of the world, while Odin in Asgard was gathering his army of the dead for the final war. The world of mortals below was not without its own grand dramas. The sagas of humanity ran parallel to the myths of the gods, filled with heroes whose courage and whose tragedies were no less epic. And of all the mortal heroes whose tales were told and retold in the feasting halls of Midgard, none was greater than Sigurd of the Völuspá clan, a man whose lineage was said to descend from Odin himself, and whose life was a tapestry of glorious deeds and inescapable cursed sorrow. Sigurd's story begins with an inheritance of broken steel and a legacy of vengeance. His father, the great hero Sigmund, was killed in battle before Sigurd was even born, and his legendary sword, Gram, was shattered in the fight. The pregnant queen, Hjördis, gathered the shards of the sword and escaped, eventually giving birth to a son at the court of another king. It was there that Sigurd grew up, fostered by a blacksmith named Regin, a man who was both a master of his craft and a master of manipulation, his heart consumed by a dark and ancient greed. Regin saw in the young, strong prince the instrument of his own revenge, and he began to fill Sigurd's head with tales of a great and terrible treasure, a hoard of gold guarded by a monstrous dragon. But this was no mere monster's hoard. It was, Regin explained, his own family's cursed inheritance. The story he told was a grim one. It began with Odin, Hymir, and Loki hunting. Loki killed an otter that was feasting on a salmon. That night, They sought shelter at the home of a magician named Hreidmar, and they showed him the otter skin. Hreidmar flew into a rage, for the otter had been his son, Otter, in disguise. He and his other two sons, Regin and Fafnir, seized the gods and demanded a vast payment of gold as compensation, enough to cover the otter skin completely. Loki was sent to find the treasure. He captured a dwarf named Anvari and forced him to give up all of his gold. As Loki was leaving, he noticed a final, beautiful golden ring on the dwarf's finger. He demanded that as well. The dwarf begged to keep it, saying it was the one ring from which he could make more gold, but Loki took it anyway. As he lost his last piece of treasure, Anvari laid a powerful curse upon the ring and the entire horde. It would bring ruin and death to any who possessed it. Loki, indifferent to the curse, returned and paid Hreidmar. But the curse began its work immediately. Fafnir, consumed by greed, murdered his own father for the treasure. He then fled with the gold to a remote heath, where his avarice and hate slowly twisted his body into the form of a monstrous, poison-breathing dragon. And there he lay for generations, sleeping on his cursed gold. This was the story Regin told Sigurd, urging the young hero to slay the dragon Fafnir and win the treasure, all while hiding his own intent to claim it for himself. To perform such a deed, Sigurd needed a sword worthy of a hero. Regin forged two magnificent blades for him, but Sigurd shattered them both with a single blow against the anvil. Finally, Sigurd brought him the broken shards of his father's sword, Gram. From these ancient fragments, Regin forged the blade anew. It was a perfect sword, so sharp it could slice a floating strand of wool in half, and so strong it could cleave the anvil itself without dulling. With the sword, Gram in his hand, Sigurd went to confront the dragon. Following the advice of a mysterious, one-eyed old man he met on the road, Odin in disguise, Sigurd did not face the beast head-on. He instead dug a deep pit on the path the dragon used to travel to its watering hole. He hid himself in the trench, and as the immense, scaled bulk of Fafnir slithered over him, Sigurd thrust the mighty sword Gram upward, deep into the creature's soft underbelly, piercing its black heart. In its dying moments, the dragon warned Sigurd of the curse that lay upon the gold he now guarded. As Sigurd stood over the slain beast, his foster father Regin appeared and asked him for a favor, to roast the dragon's heart for him. As Sigurd turned the heart over the fire, a drop of its hot blood fell onto his thumb. He instinctively put his thumb in his mouth to cool it, and in that instant, the magical properties of the dragon's blood gave him a new and wondrous ability. He could understand the language of the birds. He looked up and saw a group of woodpeckers chattering in the branches above him. They spoke of Regin's treachery, revealing that the old smith intended to kill Sigurd once he had eaten the heart, in order to keep the entire cursed horde for himself. The birds advised Sigurd to kill Regin first, eat the heart, and claim the treasure as his own. Heeding the warning, Sigurd drew the sword, Gram, and with a heavy heart, struck off the head of his treacherous foster father. He then ate a portion of the dragon's heart, which granted him great wisdom, and claimed the entire horde, including the cursed ring, Anvaranot. He was now the greatest of all mortal heroes. He had avenged his ancestors, slain a dragon, and won a treasure of unimaginable size. But the final words of the dying dragon and the dark history of the gold itself hung over him like a shadow. He had won glory, but he had also inherited a powerful curse, a destiny of strife and sorrow that would follow him for the rest of his tragically short and brilliant life. The tragic saga of the mortal hero Sigurd, with its themes of fated doom and cursed gold, was a powerful story told in the halls of men. But it was merely a single earthly echo of the much larger cosmic fate that preoccupied the king of the gods. Odin, having sacrificed his eye for wisdom and risked his life for the mead of poetry, now possessed a vast but incomplete knowledge of the future. He saw fragments of the end, he understood the nature of his enemies, but he lacked the full chronological story. To gain this final, ultimate clarity, he undertook his most profound and dangerous act of divination. He would raise a long-dead prophetess from her grave and compel her to speak of all that was, all that is, and all that is to come. He traveled to the east, to a cold and ancient land on the very edge of the worlds, to the burial mound of a powerful seeress, a vulva. These were women who practiced the highest forms of Seder, the magic of prophecy. Using his darkest necromantic spells, Odin chanted runes of power over the grave, forcing the spirit of the vulva to re-inhabit her corpse and rise from the earth. She was ancient, her memory stretching back to the dawn of time. And she was furious at being disturbed from her eternal sleep. "What man is this, unknown to me, who has disturbed my rest?" she rasped, her voice like the grinding of stones. Odin, disguised and calling himself Vegtam the Wanderer, began to question her, demanding that she tell him of the past and the future. To prove her power, the vulva began her tale at the very beginning. She spoke of the age when Ymir lived, in the yawning void of Ginnungagap, before the world was formed. She recounted the creation of the worlds from the giant's body, the rising of the sun and moon, and the first days of the gods in Asgard. She spoke of the creation of the dwarves in the earth, and of the first humans, Ask and Embla, found as driftwood on the shore. Then, to show him that she knew her questioner, she began to speak of secrets that only Odin himself could know. "I know of your pledge, Odin," she intoned, "where you laid your eye in the famed well of Ymir." She spoke of his preparations for war, of the Valkyries, and the feasting Einhajar in Valhalla. She saw the death of his beloved son, Balder, at the hand of his blind brother, and the terrible vengeance that followed. She saw the dishonorable binding of Fenrir and the unspeakable torment of Loki in the cave. She laid bare the entire history of the cosmos and the secret sorrows of the gods, proving her sight was without equal. Then, her voice dropping to a low, chilling chant, she turned her sight to the future and began to reveal the signs of the end. A great moral decay would first grip the world of men. It would be an axe age, a sword age, where shields are cloven, a wind age, a wolf age before the world falls. Brothers will fight and kill brothers, and families will be ruined by incest and strife. No one will spare another. Then the physical signs would begin. The great dog Gama will howl before the gates of hell. The chains that bind the wolf Fenrir will snap, and he will run free, his jaws gaping from the earth to the heavens. The Midgard serpent, Jörmungandr, will writhe in fury, rising from the depths and churning the oceans, causing catastrophic floods and poisoning the air with his venom. This great cataclysm will rock the ship Naglfar, a vessel made entirely from the unclipped fingernails and toenails of the human dead. And this horrifying ship will break free from its moorings. With the giant Hrym as its captain, it will sail forth, carrying an army of giants. From the south, another army will appear, the fire giants of Muspelheim, led by the great Surtur, his sword flaming brighter than the sun. As they ride north, the rainbow bridge Bifrost will shatter and collapse behind them. And from the underworld, Loki, his own bonds finally broken, will sail, steering a ship carrying the grim legions of hell. All of these forces of chaos and destruction will converge on a single point, the great battlefield called Vigrid, which is 100 leagues in every direction. Heimdall, from his post on Heaven's mountain, will see them coming. He will raise the Gjallarhorn to his lips and sound the blast that will awaken the gods and shake the roots of Yggdrasil. Odin will lead the charge at the head of his finest champions, the Einhajar, marching from the 540 doors of Valhalla, his golden helmet shining. And on the plains of Vigrid, the final battle will be joined. The Völva then foretold the fates of the great gods. Odin will fight the wolf Fenrir and will be swallowed and killed. The thunder god Thor will confront his ancient enemy, the Midgard serpent. He will succeed in killing the great beast, but he will be splattered with its deadly poison, and after staggering back 9 paces, he too will fall dead. Freya will fight the fire giant Surtur, but having long ago given away his magical sword, he will be slain. The one-handed Tyr will fight the hound Garmr, and they will kill each other. And the 2 great adversaries, the guardian Heimdall and the trickster Loki, will meet for a final time, and each will be the other's death. After the gods have fallen, the giant Surtur will cast the fire from his sword over all of creation. Flames will lick the heavens, Yggdrasil will shudder, and the entire world, consumed by the inferno, will sink beneath the waves. But the Völva's prophecy did not end there, in the silence and the dark. She saw a vision of what would come after. A new earth, green and wonderfully beautiful, would rise again from the sea. The waterfalls would cascade, and eagles would fly over the mountains. A new generation of gods would inhabit this reborn world. Odin's sons, Vidar and Vali, and Thor's sons, Modi and Magni, would survive. And most wondrous of all, Balder and his brother Höder would return from the land of the dead to live in peace in a world that would know no evil. The seeress then fell silent, her prophecy complete. Odin was left with the full and terrible weight of his knowledge, knowing now that his struggle was doomed, but that it was a struggle that must be fought so that the world might have a chance to be born anew. Odin, the All-Father, returned to Asgard from his meeting with the long-dead Völva, his one eye now burdened with the full, terrible clarity of the future. He now knew the entire shape of his world's destiny, from its fiery end to its green rebirth. This knowledge did not bring him peace. It brought a grim resolve, for he and all the gods were now living on borrowed time, watching the horizon not just for enemies, but for the prophesied signs that would herald the end of their age. For centuries, they waited. The Einhajar trained in Valhalla, Loki festered in his chains, and the sun and moon continued their cosmic chase across the sky. And then it began. Not with a bang, but with a creeping, biting cold. The first sign of the apocalypse, the first great tearing of the tapestry of fate, was the coming of Fimbulwinter, the mighty winter, or the great winter. This was no ordinary winter. It was a season of despair, a relentless, 3-year-long winter with no summers to break its icy grip. The first year was the winter of winds, where snow, driven by a ceaseless howling gale, fell from all corners of the sky at once, burying the world in a blanket of white. The second year was the winter of the sword, and the third, the winter of the wolf. The sun, Sol, and the moon, Mani, grew weak and weary in the sky, their light pale and their warmth non-existent. All the rivers and lakes and seas froze solid, and the very soil of Midgard was locked in a grip of permafrost. The life-giving cycles of nature were broken, and the world began to slowly, inexorably starve and freeze to death. This unrelenting physical hardship brought with it the moral decay the Völva had foretold. As the world's resources dwindled to nothing, the bonds that held human society together dissolved. This was the Axe Age, the Sword Age that the seeress had described. Oaths of loyalty became meaningless, the sacred laws of hospitality were forgotten, and war became the only means of survival. The bonds of kinship, the most sacred of all ties in the Norse world, shattered under the strain. Brothers fought and killed brothers for a mouthful of food, sons rose up against their fathers, and families tore each other apart in a desperate, brutal struggle. The world of men, consumed by greed and savagery, effectively destroyed itself, fulfilling the prophecy and clearing the stage for the final cosmic conflict. There is a fascinating and chilling possibility that this myth of a world-ending winter is not pure fantasy, but a distant, distorted memory of a real historical cataclysm. Around the year 536 AD, historical records from across the globe speak of a mysterious, thick dust veil that dimmed the sun for over a year. Byzantine historians wrote of a sun that gave no more light than the moon, while records from China and Ireland describe crop failures, bitter cold, and widespread famine and death. Climate data from tree rings and ice cores confirms that this period saw one of the most severe and prolonged cooling events of the last 2,000 years, likely caused by a massive volcanic eruption or a comet impact. It is a compelling hypothesis that the memory of this very real year without a summer, a terrifying time when the world seemed to be dying, was passed down through generations of oral tradition, eventually becoming magnified and mythologized into the apocalyptic Fimbulwinter. After the 3 long years of ice and strife, the next great sign appeared in the darkened sky. Since the dawn of time, the sun and the moon had been pursued across the heavens by 2 colossal wolves, Skjöll, treachery, who chased the sun, and Hati, hate, who chased the moon. For all the ages of the world, their prey had remained just out of reach. But now, in the final exhaustion of the cosmos, the chase was finally over. The wolves, their strength seemingly renewed by the world's chaos, lunged a final time. Skjöll caught and swallowed the sun. Hati caught and swallowed the moon. The world was plunged into a profound and terrifying darkness, the stars themselves vanishing from the sky as if snuffed out like candles. The devouring of the lights sent a shudder through the very axis of existence. Yggdrasil, the great world tree, trembled from its deepest roots to its highest leaves. The mountains groaned and split apart, and the earth was racked with violent convulsions. This great universal tremor was the force that broke all bonds and shattered all chains. In his dark cave, the iron-hardened entrails binding Loki snapped. On his remote island, the magical silken ribbon, Gleipnir, tore apart, freeing the monstrous wolf Fenrir. And in the underworld, the great hound Gamera broke free from his chains before the gates of hell. The agents of destruction, so long held in check, were now loose upon the world. The long, slow, grinding prelude to the end was over. The final violent act was about to begin. All of existence seemed to hold its breath, waiting in the absolute darkness for the sound that would signal the start of the final war. And so the world stood in the silent, starless dark, holding its breath. The mighty winter was over, the bonds were broken, and the final terrible prophecies of the seeress were now due to be fulfilled. From his post at the edge of the heavens, the ever-watchful Heimdall saw the approach of the world's doom. He saw the horrifying ship Naglfar, built from the uncut nails of the dead, sailing on the flood tides, its decks crowded with frost giants. He saw Loki, his face a mask of hate, steering a vessel carrying the grim legions of the underworld. He saw the fire giant Surtur and his armies of flame, their coming so bright, it was like a new, terrible sunrise in the south. Seeing all this, the white god finally raised the Gjallarhorn to his lips. He took a great breath and sounded one long, clear, piercing note. The blast echoed in every corner of the 9 worlds, shaking the roots of Yggdrasil, and in Asgard, the gods knew who the waiting was over. The twilight had come. Odin led the Aesir and his vast army of Einhajar from the 540 doors of Valhalla, a river of shining steel and heroic spirits pouring onto the plains of Asgard. Thor was at his side, his hammer Mjolnir glowing with a dull red light, his face set like stone. All the gods, the brave one-handed Tyr, the silent avenger Vidar, and the others, marched out to meet their fate on the great battlefield of Vigrid. There, under a blackened sky, the 2 great armies of order and chaos finally met. The battle that followed was not a chaotic brawl, but a series of terrible, fatal duels, a final settling of all cosmic accounts, as the prophecy had foretold. The noble Vanir god Freya, lord of the harvest, charged at the great fire giant Surtur. He fought with incredible bravery, but having long ago given his magical self-fighting sword to his servant, he was tragically cut down by Surtur's blade of flame. The great hound of hell, Garmr, lunged at the god of justice, Tyr, and in a savage flurry of tooth and steel, the 2 great warriors killed one another. The 2 eternal rivals, the guardian Heimdall and the trickster Loki, met for a final hateful confrontation in the midst of the battle. Their fight was bitter and personal, and it ended as it only could, with each being the other's death. Odin, the All-Father, clad in his golden helmet, charged on his 8-legged steed, Sleipnir, toward his own prophesied doom, the great wolf, Fenrir. The wolf's jaws gaped so wide that the lower one scraped the earth, and the upper one touched the sky. He swallowed the king of the gods in a single, terrible gulp, but Odin's death was not left unavenged. His silent son, Vidar, the god of vengeance, strode forward to face the beast. On his foot was a massive shoe, crafted from all the leather scraps that human shoemakers had ever cut from the toes and heels of their shoes. He placed this mighty boot on the wolf's lower jaw, and with his bare hands, he grabbed the beast's upper jaw and tore its head apart. Then came the final, thunderous confrontation. Thor, champion of Midgard, faced his oldest and greatest enemy, the Midgard serpent, Jörmungandr. The serpent rose from the sea, its immense coils churning the waves, its breath poisoning the very air. The battle between them was cataclysmic, a clash of thunder and venom that shook the dying world. Thor, with a final desperate roar of effort, raised his hammer Mjolnir high and brought it down upon the serpent's head, crushing its skull and ending its life. The champion had won. But as the great beast fell, It spewed a torrent of black venom, drenching the god of thunder. Thor staggered back 1 pace, then 2, then 9. And after the 9th step, he fell to his knees, choked by the poison, and died. With the champions of both sides now fallen, the battle was over. The fire giant Surtur, standing victorious amidst the dead, lifted his flaming sword high. He cast its fire over all of creation. The flames consumed the earth, the seas boiled, and Yggdrasil itself, the great world tree, was engulfed in the inferno. The burning, broken world crooned a final time, and then sank slowly back into the endless sea from whence it came. The stars were gone, the land was gone, the gods were gone. There was only silence and water and the dark. But even a story of such an ending as this is not a story of despair. After an age when the fires have cooled and the waters have calmed, the Volva's final vision comes to pass. Slowly, gently, a new earth rises from the sea. It is green and beautiful, lush with life, and bathed in a soft, clean light. The waterfalls flow again, and the fields yield crops without any sowing. In this new world, the survivors gather. Odin's sons, the Avenger Vidar and the Silent Vali, find their way to the green plains of Idavöllr. They are joined by Thor's 2 sons, the mighty Modi and Magni, who now carry their father's hammer, Mjolnir, not as a weapon of war, but as an instrument of blessing. And then, the greatest miracle of all. From the underworld, freed at last by the world's cleansing, the 2 who are lost return. Balder the Beautiful and his blind brother Höder walk together into the light, their old tragedy washed away, ready to preside over this new age of peace. Hiding within the wood of the great tree, which somehow endured, a single human man and woman, Leif and Lifthrasir, life and the will to live, survive the fire and the flood. They emerge now to repopulate this gentle, newborn world. And so, as the final images of this long and epic story begin to fade, feel the peace of that new green earth. The rage of the battle is over. The fires have been quenched. All the fear and fury has settled into a deep, quiet calm. The story of the Norse gods, for all its thunder and its sorrow, ends here, in a soft, green meadow under a gentle sun. It ends not with a bang, but with a peaceful, hopeful whisper. And now, it is time for sleep. Rest well.